Z was on one knee, holding his wounded arm while the protagonist continued to speak. The boy's voice had changed, and he had taken on an uncharacteristic note of courage. He was saying that he was no longer afraid. These few days without him, without his main fear, were the happiest days of the boy's life. He was not afraid of anything for the first time in his life and felt truly alive. Z grinned and looked at him with furious eyes. What the hell is he talking about? The man gritted his teeth, but the boy didn't hear him. He said he never wanted to go back to the past again. He gripped his knife even tighter and thrust it straight into his stomach without the fear that had plagued him all his life. Going back to this past was sheer torture. He didn't want to lose all the happiness he had now. It would be a real nightmare for him. Lose all the things he has now, it's even scarier than standing in front of his tormentor right now. The boy screamed like he was going crazy right now, but he probably was. His eyes were insane, his pupils narrowed to the extreme. His whole face was covered in scars and abrasions, but he had a beast in his soul. Without thinking for a second, he forcefully plunged the sharp blade of the knife right into his stomach. The kid felt no pain. Blood spurted in different directions. He bent in half. With this action, it was as if he put an end to all the horror that he had to endure. His whole childhood was ruined, and now he had only hate for this man in his soul. Z heaved a heavy sigh. He felt something sharp piercing his body. Naturally, the man's teeth almost fainted, but still with a terrible effort of will, he managed to stay on his feet. His face was distorted by a grimace more, but he tried desperately to fight it. The protagonist pulled the knife out of his back and looked in surprise at his tormentor. Had it really worked? A spark of hope flashed through his mind. Even he couldn't survive this. It was definitely going to kill him. Desperately, he clung to that hope, but unfortunately it all went wrong. Jay made a mad face and lunged at the boy with his fists. Surprisingly, the trick didn't seem to work on him. But that's impossible. The man felt the pain. You could see it on his face. Now he flew straight at the protagonist like a kite swinging his weighty fist. A second later, the guy felt a huge blow to his jaw. His whole consciousness seemed to do a somersault. He seemed to have gotten some teeth knocked out again. Blood spatters flew in different directions, and the boy fell backwards, unable to stay on his feet. He didn't realize anything. Had his powers stopped working? Had they failed him? No, he did exactly the right thing. He didn't feel any pain. The kid didn't understand a thing. Why is he even standing on his feet? After such a stabbing, no one could survive. But it was too late to think. Jaya shook himself and got to his feet. He didn't seem to have gotten maimed at all. Damn, that was quite painful. The man said this naturally through his teeth, and while examining his entire body. He thought he had been truly stabbed. The boy was lying on the floor, still clutching the handle. But that's impossible. How could he endure such pain? The boy was just out of breath from surprise and fear. Z looked at him with crazy eyes, now looking like a bull. Now this little brat will definitely die. The man roared this in a sort of comfortable voice, the way a bear usually roars when it is about to rush at its prey. The protagonist was scared to death. He noticed the madness in his opponent's eyes. The boy had already resigned himself to the fact that now he was definitely a dead man. But he was still trying to calm himself down and put himself in order. Though with his mind he did not realize that now he would definitely not get away. Shivering with fear, he stabbed himself in the leg with his hand. He had to keep attacking so that this freak wouldn't get to him. Otherwise he would be finished. The boy tried his best to avoid danger in any way he could. However, despite his best efforts, G lunged at him like a kite with his arms out to the sides. In a second, he was going to be hit with renewed vigor. He didn't seem to be taking any damage at all. But how could that be possible? He was stabbing himself with a knife. Does this man feel no pain at all? The boy grasped his knife once more in an attempt to make some sort of attack. But Z was faster. He fell on top of him and pinned him down with his heavy body. The boy groaned. Splinters flew in different directions towards me. The man held tight, and he had no chance to defend himself in any way. He intercepted the hand of the protagonist, preventing him from using the knife. The boy tried his best to break free, but the grip of this freak was incredibly strong. It was as if his arm was taken away from him. He stopped feeling it. With horror, he realized that the only weapon that could protect him was now out of his reach. The boy opened his eyes with fear, and already resigned to his fate, looked into the eyes of his tormentor, who sat down on him, pressing him to the ground even harder. Junho closed his eyes and turned his head to the side. Ready to take the blow, the man swung his fist with all his might, ready to teach the little one a lesson. He held tightly so that his victim could not break free. A second more, and a real hail of blows fell on the face of the protagonist. The man hit without even trying. The pain was unbearable. It felt like he was being hit in the face with a huge, heavy hammer. Galva's fists were very hard because he was often involved in fights. The boy lay on the ground and patiently endured the blows. His face was already distorted in a grimace of horror, and bloody bruises appeared on it. But suddenly, something out of the ordinary happened. The boy pushed himself up with all his might. Tensing all the muscles of his abdomen, he suddenly straightened up and threw his opponent away. The man could not resist, and not expecting such a repulse, flew back. He landed face down on the ground and he couldn't understand a thing. What the hell is going on? The loser pushed him back. How could this even happen? He gritted his teeth and couldn't understand anything at all because he was so helpless. So what just happened? The protagonist gritted his teeth and kept stabbing himself, screaming all the while for his abuser to finally die. It was like the guy went crazy. His face changed beyond recognition. There was no trace of that fragile boy who was afraid of every rustle. Now he was just a hate-filled monster. Z quickly rose to his feet, and in order to prevent him from stabbing him again, he quickly reacted and rushed at him, preparing his fists. This son of a bitch is going to die. The man was furious. He didn't understand how this brat could fight back. A few seconds later, another powerful punch flew into his face. The protagonist didn't even try to dodge, but just lay on the ground holding tightly to the hilt of his knife. He was hitting himself harder and harder to at least hurt this freak. Jae-wen pounced on him again and began to strike him with even more force. Blood spatters and teeth splinters flew in different directions. The boy kept the knife in his hands all this time, trying in vain to strike him again. The man sat on top of him again, pushing him down with his legs. Junho lay on the ground, blows raining down on his face like hail. Why? Just how can he take that kind of pain? Is this even human? He continued to endure as blood poured out of his mouth. The boy was about to lose consciousness. From so many blows, probably no one would be able to resist. Z suddenly grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and threw his head back, as if trying on the next blow. The boy could do nothing but lie there and patiently await his fate. All his clothes were stained with blood. They were lying on the ground like two beasts fighting for prey. Z shook his head, and with all his might hit the boy directly in the forehead. Sparks flew from their eyes. The protagonist felt his consciousness slowly leaving him. His head was all jumbled up. It felt like a train had hit him in the head. His head hung limply. He only managed to let out a squeezed-out tone. The boy was about to pass out, his eyes darkened, and his tormentor continued to hold the boy by the scruff of the neck, hunching over him. Z looked at him with eyes full of hatred. The boy could hardly understand anything anymore. His whole face was swollen with innumerable blows. Galwa clenched his teeth and said that he could resist all he wanted, but there was nothing he could do. Fuck him. The boy's nose was bleeding with his snot. He looked at his teacher with a look of incomprehension and fear. He had already accepted that there was no way he could hurt that bastard. He could only wait patiently for his fate. His whole calm and measured life was crumbling right before his eyes. Galwa just blazing with rage, he shouted that let the guy not forget that he exists in this life only to be a punching bag. Damn sad to watch him rely on his little strength. He screamed that he was going to take everything away from him, just like his mother. These words struck the boy to the core. It was the last straw. This time he had run out of patience. The boy gripped the hilt of his knife even tighter. No one in this world dare touch his family. Grabbing the knife, the boy grouped himself and swung it with all his might, trying to hit his assailant right in the neck. But Zian backed up a bit. The man was completely shocked. How could this loser even find the strength in the first place? The protagonist's eyes filled with blood. He held onto his knife and had no plans to retreat. These words struck his brain like a bolt of lightning, and now his main goal was to kill this freak. He swung once more and aimed the knife blade straight at his opponent's chest. But the man blocked the blow in time by grabbing the protagonist's hand and squeezing it tightly to the point of crunching. The knife stopped just a few centimeters from his neck. Z looked at the boy with a surprised and even a little frightened look. How dare he try to hit him, begging sign the boy was the first time in his life he faced such a fierce rebuff. Usually all his victims just ran out of pain and would never dare to hit him back. This time something was different. Juno Yi wasn't going to stop. He screamed like a wounded animal and swung his small fist, aiming straight at the freak's forehead. The boy gathered in this blow all his hatred, all his strength that he had left. There was no retreat. He had to defend his honor and stop this outrage. This time he succeeded. The blow hit exactly on target, resounded from a mighty height, and his hand touched Galva's cheek. The man couldn't have dodged it if he had wanted to, and now he felt the pain spreading throughout his body. His cheek was burning with fire and pain was spreading through his body. I think he had a few teeth out of his mouth. The boy rose to his feet, breathing heavily. His opponent too had fallen a few meters to the side and now stood on one knee. They looked at each other as if they were two beasts fighting to the death. The protagonist, breathing heavily, rose on shaky legs. He stared at his rival furtively, consciousness slowly returning to his ringing head. In a quiet, hoarse voice, he began to speak. Z was right that the boy looked pathetic, relying on those powers in an attempt at revenge. His face was covered in blood and numerous bruises, but he still spoke. However, there was one nuance here. The boy's lips quivered. The kin was overflowing with blood from the blows. Z, at this moment, he realized that he was about to be finished. He bulged his eyes wide and concentrated everything into his attention. Everything inside him shrank with the fear of death. It was the first time he had ever felt such a sensation in his life. The protagonist shouted that anyway. It was better than nothing. The boy swung his knife as hard as he could and aimed straight for his heart. His eyes lit up with some strange lights, as if it wasn't a human at all. At that moment, his opponent felt a long, forgotten feeling of fear, something that had remained far in the past and now once again reminded him of himself, now his voice sounding even a little scared. He shouted for the boy to just stop. Strangely, at this moment he had no hatred, only fear for his own life as he realized that now it would probably end. But unfortunately it was all too late. His heart was pierced by a blade piercing through him. At that moment his eyes went dark. The feeling spread throughout his body like an inexorable flood. Z felt like he was short of breath. Something prickled sharply in his chest and his eyes widened with fear. The last of the steel was fading in them. Now his entire life, for which he had not done a single honorable deed, was flashing before him. The boy fell to the ground, clutching his chest. Life was gradually leaving him in great leaps and bounds. He was no longer able to even breathe properly. Only a strangled wheeze escaped from his throat. The man made a death grimace. His body slowly began to fall sideways. Saliva flowed from his mouth, and a final groan sounded in the neighborhood. The man continued to stare deadly into the distance. He didn't even close his eyes before he died. His face still had the same grimace of horror on it. All he had time to say before he died was to call the protagonist a dream, and that was the end of his short life. His heart stopped beating for good. The protagonist stood a little distance from the dead body and breathed heavily, trying to come to his senses, but still not letting go of the knife as if sensing imminent danger. The boy straightened up and looked up at the sky, still trying to get his thoughts in order. There were trickles of blood on his face and his heart was racing. Now in the place of his chest, his clothes were torn from the cut. It seems at this second the protagonist finally lost his mind. He looked at his tormentor with his head bowed and began to speak. It's not enough to kill him. He just feels pain, like the boy couldn't believe he'd succeeded. His face was swollen. One eye was almost covered with a bruise, and now he could barely see. The boy kept muttering something to himself in a frantic voice. But this time, he wouldn't use his powers. He would finish him off with his own hands. Z already had been dead for a long time, but the boy still couldn't believe it. Saliva flowed from his mouth and his eyes were covered with a white film. Junho said he doesn't care what happens to him anymore. All he wants is for that freak to finally disappear from this world. He leaned over the body of his rival and prepared to finish him off for good. The boy grasped the handle of his knife and prepared himself. It was time for this freak to finally die. The boy couldn't remember himself from rage and joy. The knife was literally a few centimeters away from the man's body. But suddenly, something pushed it away. Some invisible hand blocked his path, throwing him aside. The boy went flying before he could think of anything. A few meters away from him stood Mark with his hand out in front of him. On his palm burned the very same cross. In a calm voice, the boy said that was the end of it. That was enough. He stood and looked at the protagonist with a kind of sympathy. The protagonist looked at him, and his eyes overflowed with fear and not understanding. Mark continued to speak. He said that this man must have learned his lesson. The protagonist didn't understand what was even going on. What was he doing? Mark put his hand out in front and told the man to stay back and stand his ground. There was a small haze of smoke around them from the violent impact. They stood opposite each other and glared at each other with surprised looks. The main character couldn't stand it, and it was like he came to his senses. He yelled for the guy to stay back. He's going to kill the creep after all. The boy again as if lost his mind. The shock had not yet completely left him, and now again possessed his body. But the protagonist did not even suspect that behind him is already flying energy sphere. The guy as if lost everything in his field of vision. His attention was focused only on his victim. He still couldn't believe that his victim was dead. It took literally a fraction of a second for a huge explosion to shake the earth. Shards of the road flew in different directions, though he was a few meters away from the protagonists, but Junho felt a tremor under his feet. Mark looked at the protagonist with a stern look. Something changed in his eyes. He no longer looked as good-natured as the first time. The boy repeated in a rough voice that the protagonist should stay where he was, or he would be worse off. There was a metallic note in that voice. Junho looked at him with a frightened look. He certainly didn't expect it, and couldn't even realize what had just happened. Was his comrade really going to kill him? He had done the right thing, the boy convinced himself. Mark held on to his hand, from which for some reason smoke was coming out. The boy felt unbearable pain, but he showed that everything was all right. He couldn't show weakness. For many years of possessing this ability, he had already learned to control his pain. Junho looked at him and his whole body trembled with fear. This time he was seriously scared. He realized that this guy could model him, so the best option was to stop. On shaky legs, the boy stood up and said he wanted to ask Mark something. Why the hell is he helping this creep? They stood across from each other and watched every move carefully. This man deserved to die, didn't he? The boy was sure that all his actions were right. He was just protecting his normal life after all. Mark once again changed from anger to mercy, and said that he was sure he had warned him last time. Just let the boy just forget about his place, that's not the answer. The protagonist's face had already completely changed. It was blue like a dead man's. All in blood stains, his mouth was missing a lot of teeth. The boy pulled his teeth and coughed. He said it's easy for him to say. Does he even realize what that freak did to him? Inside him, his anger slowly began to boil up again. The boy screamed again, and in that scream was rage, pain, and despair. He had waited for this day. Who was he to stop him? What right does he have to do that? The boy screamed, and it seemed as if the whole town could hear his scream. The main character shouted to him that he too had signed a contract with Mephisto after all. Mark frowned and looked at him through his thick hair. He bowed his head and fell silent. The protagonist clenched his fist. Shouted that he wasn't going to forgive anyone. Mark held out his hand, and the cross on his palm glowed again. In a calm voice, he told the boy to go home. Suddenly there was a hissing sound, as if a kettle was boiling somewhere. Junho. As if not listening to him, the boy made a dash towards him and grabbed his knife. He shouted for the man to finally shut up. It was as if he was possessed by the devil himself, and now he would not rest until he had killed all of his abusers. His pupils turned red. The boy held the knife in his hands and screamed with rage. He screamed for Mark to stay out of his way, or he would kill him too. He had already approached him at arm's length when a burst of magical energy appeared between them, which for a second even blinded the protagonist. It was as bright as if the sun had come down to earth. There was a deafening whistle which made the boy's ears pop. He didn't know what the hell it was. Naturally, in his teeth, the boy tried his best to stay on his feet, but there was such a wind as if a hurricane was about to start. Mark flashed his eyes and stored up enough energy to repel the attack of this demonic brat. He had no other choice, even though he realized that he could kill the boy with this spell. There was a deafening explosion. Mark used Fury Storm, and a bright flash of light illuminated the entire space. The powerful sound wave threw the protagonist far away. He could not stay on his feet and flew far back. A few seconds later, the boy landed on the ground, his breathing hitched. He clenched his teeth and felt an unnatural pain in his back. However, it wasn't enough to kill him now. Marka thought, the boy is unable to use his powers right now. There must be a trigger for them which he is currently unaware of. The protagonist sat on the ground and looked at his opponent with a fierce gaze. Right now, he was like a cornered beast, clinging to life with his last strength. Mark stood opposite him, still holding his arm out in front of him. It was his last warning. His voice became firm, and it was clear that I was going to retreat. He looked at the protagonist with a look full of sympathy, and even some fear. Mark said that the boy should return home immediately, for otherwise it would be worse for him. Juno didn't listen to him. He took hold of his knife again and rushed towards him with fury. The boy screamed something unintelligible and ran at Mark with even more fury. It was unclear where he got so much strength from. He raised his hand up, and the cross on his palm glowed even stronger. There had to be something to stop this madness, or the boy would turn into a monster for good. In a few seconds, a bright circle with incomprehensible biblical symbols appeared above his head. It looked like a small sun, scattering its rays. Mark stood firmly on his feet with his hand up. A bright light also came from his hand. To stop the mad boy, he had to use a punishment spell on Maria. His lips whispered the spell, and pain spread through his body. A few seconds later, an energy storm descended on the main character. It pressed him into the ground with such force that cracks came from it. The spell worked as it should, and now the boy was firmly pressed to the earth. Lee says together the main character to ruin him. He is taking Jagalva with him, and it is better for the boy not to follow them. He lifted Z's defatted body in his arms, and with quick steps headed in the opposite direction for a farewell. Mark said, he believes that the protagonist will think twice about his place henceforth if they meet again because of this. It will be the last time. Turning around, he over his shoulder told the boy that unless he changed his mind, in which case they would be enemies. The protagonist was still lying pinned to the ground by an incomprehensible magical force. Junho cried out from the last of his strength, his body seething with madness and a boundless desire for revenge. He screamed, and in his cry was expressed all the pain he had endured. Once again, he failed to fulfill his intended revenge. Mark didn't listen to him anymore. He carried Z in his arms without turning back. The hero kept shouting at him to stay where he was, but Mark was no longer listening to him. The boy remained lying pressed to the ground, tears rolling down his cheeks. And now he had once again missed his worst enemy. Is this not the end of his suffering? He fell exhausted to the ground, and consciousness finally left his head. Z sat leaning against the wall, and he seemed to be unconscious. His eyes slowly opened, and consciousness returned to his ringing head. The man mumbled something under his breath and asked where he was. The man finally woke up and began to twirl his head in different directions. Had he really come to his senses? That realization hit him like a hammer on the head. The first thing he saw in front of his face was Lee Xiun's pale face. He still couldn't fully understand everything that had happened to him. Mark calmly said that this guy had almost taken his life, and now he suggested to leave this kid alone. He stood a little ways away from his friend, leaning against the wall. They were in some unfamiliar place, but they seemed relatively safe. Z clenched his teeth and began to speak. His voice was more like an animal's growl. That's what he's saying after what he did? He tried to kill him. He's just a fucking asshole. Didn't he warn him last time that he'd kill him if he came here again? The man was filled with anger. So why did he come here again? What is he doing here? Mark looked at him with a calm, serious gaze and didn't say a word. They stood opposite each other with Mephistopheles. The demon was saying in a sweet voice that there was also one condition in the contract. Mark was surprised and looked at him. What was the condition? Demon's face stretched in a wide smile. He put his finger to his lips and hissed, "Let the guy not divulge the details of their contract. Confidentiality is very important, isn't it?" The demon looked at him with its black, failing eyes. Without a second's hesitation, the boy nodded affirmatively, even though he was disgusted to enter into a contract with this devil. The demon laughed. "He's catching it on the fly. That's a good quality." He grinned and hissed through his teeth, saying that if the boy broke the contract with him, he would pay in full, and the currency would be his soul. Lee looked at his comrade with a calm gaze. He remembered all these events of his recent life, when he had to sacrifice his soul to make a contract with this ugly man. There was an emptiness in his soul, so huge that it could have consumed him himself. The guy tried his best to fight his inner demons. He turned his back to his friend and said, "This kid is a lot more dangerous than he thinks. Let the man make sure he never crosses paths with him again." On shaky legs, Z stood up and was about to say something. He clenched his teeth and asked angrily, "What the hell is he talking about?" The man didn't understand anything. What was even going on? He had just risen from the dead. Would his friend try to explain something? But suddenly, here's the overexertion. He grabbed his chest. Something prickled in his heart, and the man fell to the ground, unable to stay on his feet. His whole body weakened in a second, as if life was leaving him again. He fell to his knees and tried to catch his breath. Mark looked down at him and continued to speak calmly. Let him look at himself. Look at the result of his actions. He'd be dead by now if Mark hadn't taken care of his wounds. Can't he at least thank him? By turning to face him. Let him think of it as the last favor he'd done him as a friend. And let the man dare not attack Junho unless he wants to die again. Mark said goodbye to them and asked him to take care of himself. Jay didn't stop. He held his chest and shouted that he would finally finish this loser off. He would kill them all. The man screamed, and there was rage and despair in his scream. Gritting his teeth, he stared after his departing friend. He screamed at him that he would kill them all. Kill him and that little bastard Junho too. At that moment, his mind was filled with questions. How dare that little brat? How dare he raise his hand on him? How dare he do that to him? The man clenched his teeth and tried to get to his feet, but his strength left his body, and he fell to the ground again, groaning. The protagonist was in his apartment and was sitting in the bathtub. His body was covered with bruises, and his strength was almost exhausted. The very mark that was on his arm was gradually consuming his body. After this incident, he had to miss a couple days of school to recover. The mark had grown so large that it had already completely engulfed his arm and climbed up his chest. Perhaps the boy overdid it, so the symbol slowly began to cover his body. Junho flopped onto the sink and tried to get up. The boy was breathing hard. His body felt like it was on fire. His strength was getting less and less. All he needed now was a good night's sleep. The boy looked in the mirror. From there, he saw an emaciated face covered in bruises and bruises. Sighing heavily, he began to ask himself questions. Why did Shiyun help this freak? And besides, where does he get his powers from? In his mind, the very incident when the guy had hit him with some kind of energy discharge was running through his mind. He still couldn't figure out where this guy got so much strength from. Who the hell was he? The protagonist couldn't help himself and fell to the floor again against the wall. The boy sank into his thoughts. This man was too strong for him. He couldn't defeat him even if he wanted to. The boy gritted his teeth. He wouldn't be able to do anything as long as this type was stapled next to him. Inside him, anger was beginning to rage again. He wanted so badly to deal with this creep who had bullied him his whole life. And now he had eluded him once more. He got down on his knees and began pounding his fist into the ground. The devil. He has strength, but is it useless? The blows came one after another and the mirror began to vibrate. The boy was beyond furious. Suddenly his phone vibrated. A message seemed to come in. It was Yun-hee. She had sent him a message, concerned, asking why the boy was not showing up at school. The boy turned to his phone. It had indeed been quite some time since he was last in school. And there everything went on as usual. The fat boy was on his knees. Next to him were several high school students who were once again bullying him. One of them was laughing loudly. The fat man looked like a huge frog. He got hit right in the stomach. Look how he curled up in a ball. One of them went up to the poor fat man and gave him 1,000 won. and told him to bring him something he knew, right? The fat man nodded his head and rose obediently. The guy smiled his predatory smile and said that Fatty would get 10 punches for every second he was late. This freak's name was Jung Haiwan, and he was 17 years old. He's not strong but has plenty of dirty tricks up his sleeve. Hangs out with Jung Somu. Fatty and ran to go shopping in a flash. He had fear in his heart as he realized that there was nothing he could do, and he only had to obey the orders of these creeps. Soon he ran to the local store. The guy frantically ran his eyes over the display cases with goods and still didn't know what he could buy. What could he buy with 1,001? A pack of gum? No. Damn, he should have asked. The boy sighed heavily. After all, he could have told him what to bring. Suddenly, the fat guy's eye fell on one of the display cases on which lay a packet of chips. And then a wonderful idea struck him. At last he had found a way out. His eyes lit up with joy. At last he wouldn't be beaten. Jung stood and counted down the time. 5, 4, 3, 2. There were only a few seconds left for Fatty to come. Otherwise, he would have to endure the beating again. Suddenly, the door swung open with a bang, and Fatty appeared on the doorstep holding a packet of chips and panting and shouting that he was back. The boys looked at him with displeased looks. Jung clapped his hands. Good job, Frog, second to second. He looked admiringly at the fat man. Well, now they'll see what he brought. The fat man approached him and with trembling hands brought him a packet of chips. The guy looked at it with a surprised look and immediately fury awoke in him. A grimace of rage appeared on his face. What had he just done, fucking idiot? He told me to bring the fat man food. He was supposed to bring cigarettes. The boy was furious. The fat man had spent his money and fucked up. There was a look of horror on the fat man's face. Cigarettes? He couldn't have bought them. That's not fair. Not only was he not told what to buy, he couldn't buy cigarettes. He couldn't buy them. He's a schoolboy. Just then, a powerful blow hit him in the stomach. The boy bent and flew backwards. Jung gritted his teeth in anger. The toad had screwed up again. The boy couldn't stand on his feet and rolled like a kolobok. He shrank into a ball, still clutching the bag of chips in his hand. The boy had already resigned himself to the fact that he was going to be beaten again. Jung walked up to him and looked at him like he was trash. Basically, to him, the other people were trash. He came even closer to the fat man and said in a stern voice that he was disappointed in him. He still did not understand him. Well, when he had disappointed him, he would have to punish the fat man again. The boy bent down and, continuing to breathe heavily, clutched the packet of chips in his hands. Jung walked up to him and stomped on a bag of chips with one punch. The food scattered on the floor. The guy smiled and laughingly said, "Next stop, Payne." The fat guy yelled for the guy to stop and not to touch him. He stood in front of the fat man and told him to accept to eat the crumbs. He lets him eat them because they're friends. But there's something missing. The guy said this with such feigned good-naturedness that it even made me sick. But then he realized, right, not enough jam, and slowly began to let out a big blob of saliva from his mouth. It gathered in a big drop and began to drip down. The clod of saliva slowly pulled itself down and fell onto a packet of chips. The fat man looked at it with horror and the realization that he was now going to have to eat this nasty stuff. The boy picked up the packet of chips, and immediately he was cliched, ordered to lick it clean. The boy began renaming the packet of chips in his hands, and it crunched treacherously. The boy stared at the abomination, hot tears running down his cheeks. He sighed heavily, and realized he couldn't go on like this. He prayed for someone to come to his aid. He couldn't take it any longer. He would be thrown into the mud. He turned his head and suddenly saw a familiar silhouette. It was the main character. He had a bandage on his face, and his eye was bandaged with a Band-Aid. The boy was walking forward as if he didn't notice anyone around him. A joyful smile appeared on the fat man's face. Could he really be saved? This is his savior. The boy will definitely help. The boy was already overjoyed. His face shone with happiness. The boy ran out of the room and immediately rushed to the protagonist. Joyfully, he shouted words of greeting to him. The boy was surprised and looked toward his comrade. What happened to him? A look of concern flashed across his face. Dong-ho approached him and began to beg him for help with a pleading look. He's his savior. The boy's eyes were burning with happiness. He couldn't believe that now he would finally get help. Junho looked over there carefully. What, Junho's back? A look of surprise flashed across his face. Somu looked there with indifference. What are those losers up there up to? The man wrinkled his face in a disgruntled grimace. Dongwoo entered the room, followed by the protagonist. The fat man turned rudely to the guys who had so recently bullied him. This time, Fatty looked much more confident than last time. He shouted that the guys were in big fucking trouble now. They should get down on their knees if they cared about their lives. The protagonist followed him and looked ahead with an uncomprehending stare. What was Fatty up to again? Jung grinned and walked closer. Is that son of a bitch out of his mind? But the fat man wouldn't stop. He shouted that Jung was the only one who would die here. Let him come closer. The fat man laughed again. The protagonist had already realized where this was going, and just stared intently ahead. The patch over his eye covered almost half of his face, but the boy was looking forward intently. The fat man stopped a few meters away from his tormentors, and got into a fighting stance, but still hiding behind the protagonist. He held him by the arm and hoped to be helped. The fat man had already lost his fear so much that he just yelled at them. Come on, freaks. Let them try to take him. The fat man laughed again. They'll all die and piss in their underpants. The guys looked amongst themselves. Somu looked somewhere to the side and said, That fucking toad's completely out of his mind. It looked like he was out of his mind after their blows. The fat man couldn't stop laughing. No, he's out of his mind. What happened? They're scared. Jung gritted his teeth and looked at the fat man with a killer look. Does he think another loser will protect him? No, he's already dead. He's finished. The boy looked at his victim as if he was ready to tear him apart with his bare hands. The fat man couldn't stop laughing and grinned through all his teeth. No matter, he would never forgive them. The boy was already anticipating the taste of victory now. They would show this freak real pain together. His face stretched in a wide grin. Okay. He turned to his friend and said it's time to show these freaks some of their justice. But the protagonist calmly turned to him. The boy looked at the toll booth in surprise. Is that why he called him? The fat man did not understand anything and began to turn his head in different directions. He thought his friend would help him. Suddenly, a look of horror came over his face. The protagonist said he couldn't do anything anyway, so he's leaving. The boy turned around and didn't say another word. The fat man looked at him in surprise and immediately realized that he was now in a disastrous situation. He clung with all his might to the hope that he would finally get help. He grabbed hold of the main character and pulled his hand back. The guy didn't want to give up on the idea that he had at least someone to protect him. Where is he going? He's his savior. The fat man's voice trembled with fear. He realized that if he didn't do anything, these creeps would just kill and trample him. The protagonist looked at him in surprise. Savior. The boy was surprised. And why was it that he was awarded such a title? He looked down at the fat man. Junho said the boy just wanted to use him. And what would change if he helped him? A begging sign in his voice. I could hear the indifference. He certainly didn't want to get involved in this showdown. His bright and peaceful life had just begun. The fat man couldn't believe what he was hearing. But the boy kept talking. Even if these brats disappeared forever, as long as he himself didn't change, things like this would happen to them all the time. The first one to start with is himself. The fat man couldn't believe it. He grabbed hold of the protagonist's scruff and started shaking him. Why won't he help him? Now Fatty was angry with him. Would he just let it go? He pinned the protagonist against the wall and started shaking him by the scruff of his neck. Enough of this nonsense. Just let him do what he did to Kenjona, with his finger on the two guys, and yelled for the guy to just kill those creeps. But the main character stood motionless and didn't even think of doing anything. The boy stood, turning his head aside. He really didn't want to do the same thing again. He just wanted to live quietly so that no one would bother him. Just to live the quiet school days that he wanted so much. Somu laughed, it was true. Kenjon had been beaten up by that loser. A smile appeared on the man's face. He was remembering those very recent events. Jung laughed, he still couldn't believe it. He knows Kenjon has a temper, but this was simply impossible. He couldn't lose to such a weakling. Somu was suddenly wary, the smile missing from his face. Wait, he felt like those two were just stalling. His friend told him to calm down and just watch. I think something's about to happen. The fat man continued to hold the protagonist by the scruff of the neck, and had already started to cry. But the protagonist did not say anything. He just kept silent now, stood and waited. He really wanted to get rid of this annoying boy as soon as possible, as his quiet life had only recently begun. The fat man bowed his head and began to cry. Through his tears, he told the protagonist that he is the only one who understands how he feels. So he asks him to help him just this once. Just let him see these assholes are messing with him too. But the protagonist didn't really want to do that. He quietly apologized and said he couldn't do anything. The fat man swore and gritted his teeth in anger. His eyes filled with rage. He called the protagonist a freak. While he was out of school, he was beaten twice as much. They're in the same fucking boat. Is he going to get killed if he helps a friend? Fatty sent him away out of anger. Suddenly, the protagonist looked at him with a sizzling gaze after saying those words, and took hold of his hand. He ordered the fat man in a calm and quiet voice to let him go. The fatty noticed the change in his facial expression and his knees shook. What has happened to him? This guy is scaring him. Why does he look like that? The boy saw something in the protagonist's eyes and started to stagger back step by step. A faint tone came out of his mouth. The boy was scared now, probably even more than those two standing behind him. At least they were human. The protagonist continued to stare at him with his crazed gaze. His pupils dilated. He looked like a ghost now. His skin was as pale as a dead man's. Dong-Hu fell to the floor and began to crawl backwards. Now he saw someone else in the face of the main character. It was definitely not a human. It was a real monster. From such fear, the boy even wet his pants. Junho didn't say anything. He just turned around and walked towards the exit. The boy didn't say a word. It was as if he had lost all the humanity he had until that moment. Dong-Ho continued to sit on the floor in a puddle of his own urine. The protagonist turned around without saying a word and walked towards the exit, leaving his friend alone with the two freaks who were ready to kill him. Dong-Hu looked at him with a frightened look. He couldn't get rid of the thought that he saw someone else in front of him. There was no trace of his comrade, and it was as if some unknown creature had taken up residence inside him. He was definitely no longer human. The fat man had not yet recovered from what he had seen when Jung appeared beside him and put his arm around his shoulders. Now, what had he told him 5 minutes ago? He had a smile on his face. He was going to get even with the fat man, and now he had a good reason to do so. The fat man, realizing the hopelessness of his situation, knelt down in front of the guy and started begging him for mercy. He got it all wrong, but I think it was too late. Nothing could be undone. Now the fat man's foot was flying into the fat man's face. Now he'd never get away with a beating. He'd said too much, and now he'd have to answer for it. Jung punched the fat man in the face with all his might. Yuck, it smells like pigs. The fatty couldn't help himself and fell on his back with a loud sound. This sound was like a frog falling to the ground. The guy smiled and ordered him to get up. Who even cares about a lowlife like him? Even his fellow loser couldn't protect him. There was a smile on the man's face. Now he was anticipating what he would definitely smash this fatty into the walls. Dong-Hu lying on the ground while his offender's foot pressed harder and harder on his cheek. All the while the boy was thinking, why did his comrade do this to him? Why had he abandoned him? After all, they were friends. Hatred and fear settled in him. But that wasn't what he had to worry about now. The fat man wouldn't stop wailing. Why did he do this to him? He was no different from him. How dare he? Fatty seemed to be in a hopeless situation, and all he had to do was wait patiently. Soon the protagonist came to the hospital where Gino was staying. The guy walked in the large corridors and looked for the room of his comrade. He realized that he was to blame for what happened to him, but had not yet visited him once. It wasn't allowed. The boy turned his head in different directions trying to find the right room. He checked his phone to get his bearings in the place. In thought, he looked somewhere. Suddenly he was called by a familiar voice. The boy was startled and surprised. Gino stood some distance away from him and waved at him in a friendly manner. The boy asked in a friendly manner what he was doing here. Junho walked up to him and noticed that he no longer had a bandage on his arm. What? He healed so quickly. That's funny. The boy couldn't believe it. Gino looked at his arm too and nodded his head. Yeah, it's still a little sore, but the doctor said he's fine. Gino suddenly nudged him with his elbow and smiled. Did he just come to see him? The boy laughed ironically, and visually he said he was quite embarrassed by such attentiveness. The protagonist was also embarrassed, and said that he was to blame for what happened to him after all. Gino put his hands behind his head and said that the doctor said he could go. His throat was dry, so have the protagonist buy him a drink. The boy smiled and nodded his head. It was the least he could do for him. Gino enjoyed drinking the milk bought by the protagonist. The hospital only had water that tasted disgusting. They finally bought him something tasty to drink, and stretched out in a satisfied smile. This is unparalleled. He loves banana smoothie. He smiled and said that he was very happy, since he didn't think that besides Shihun, someone would come to visit him. The main character smiled. The guys decided to have a drink. Suddenly hearing Lee's name, the protagonist was surprised. Does he know him? Gino continued to drink the banana smoothie with pleasure. Gino looked at the protagonist in surprise. What about him? Does he know him? The guy was very surprised that the boy knew his friend. After all, they had only crossed paths a few times. Junho scratched the back of his head and hesitated. He didn't know what to say, and carefully chose his words not to say too much. He didn't want to give away all his secrets. He didn't know what to say or how best to begin. And there was a lot to tell. Nevertheless, the protagonist made up his mind, and told his comrade everything as it was. Soon they were sitting on a bench, and the protagonist leaned his head forward. He said he didn't remember exactly what had happened. But when he woke up, it was at his house. Gino was sitting next to him, and he looked wistfully at the boy. He looked at his friend with an uncomprehending look, but still listened intently to everything. The protagonist continued. This is what he said to him. The boy continued to tell everything in a trembling voice. He looked in front of him with a frightened look. He needed someone to talk to after all. Mark told him that he had made a deal with the demon before he did. Gino replied that he already knew that. Hearing this, the protagonist looked at him in surprise. He already knew already. Now that was hard to believe. Gino continued. He said that he kind of now understood why he had it. Junho rolled up his sleeve and questioned his friend. Was he talking about this symbol? Suddenly, the boy seemed to catch on. He remembered that the others could not see the symbol. But why could his friend see it? Gino kept looking somewhere in the distance. Suddenly, the main character asked him, Does he have superpowers like Shihun? Gino looked at him with a surprised look, as if he didn't know what the guy was talking about. Or maybe he wasn't listening to him at all. He asked him again what the guy was talking about. The protagonist was startled and waved his hands in an attempt to justify himself. No, let him forget it. He didn't say anything. The boy tried his best to change the subject. Gino thoughtfully asked him if Junho remembered how he had taken out that fat man. The boy remembered, and said it had been really cool back then. A happy smile reappeared on his face. Gino lifted up and in a serious voice asked, Does he think he did it with ordinary physical strength? The protagonist looked at him in surprise. It seems he was beginning to guess something, but he stubbornly didn't want to believe it. Gino walked forward a bit. No matter how fast he is, it's unrealistic to beat a big guy like him. If it's a half-weight like himself, that person will invariably lose. The protagonist offered to listen and watch him carefully. Gino, does he remember how that fatty flew back against the wall like a sack of shit? It was all thanks to holy powers, wasn't it? The guy turned to his friend and looked at him with a smile. The protagonist didn't get it. Holy powers? What is he talking about? The boy continued to sit on the bench and understood nothing. Gino continued talking. He decided to show his comrade his powers. His fist suddenly glowed with light electric energy. Yes, by using these powers, he gains Superman's abilities, which give him speed and incredible strength. However, there is one nuance. If he uses these powers to the max, he can get hurt. Therefore, he is stronger than a lot of people. The guy clenched his fist, and it glowed like a lantern. The protagonist looked at his friend in surprise and even a bit scared. Even he has superpowers. What's going on? A note of consternation flashed across his face. Gino continued. But still, he had no idea how Galwa was able to withstand his blows. He's a real monster after all. The boy laughed a merry laugh. He looked at his friend and told him not to use his powers if they can't help anyone. Does he know what the sign on his hand is? The protagonist looked at him in surprise. The guy held out his hand to him and rolled up his sleeve again. Is he talking about that tattoo? Yeah, that's the one, but what is it? Gino made a serious expression on his face and began to speak. It's the breath of a leviathan. Unlike Mephisto, which is imitated by a demon, then this power belongs to the archdevil. He is the lord of all evil. They call him the serpent of chaos who wipes out everything he sees in his path. And Mephisto is just the freak who put this dangerous power inside him. Now the boy's life is in danger. The protagonist wondered. His comrade what also knows about this demon? Gino replied that Mephisto is infamous. He has done enough evil to be famous amongst everyone. He lowered his head and said with some sadness that this was the demon responsible for Shihun's fate. He didn't think that the same thing would happen to the protagonist. The boy became very sad. The protagonist took his head, but why would a demon choose to give that power to someone like him? He just couldn't understand it. He's weak, he has nothing but hate in him, he can't stand up for himself. So why? Gino turned his back to him and rhetorically asked if he knew the story of Faust. The protagonist thought for a moment. Faust? Is this the same Roman? Yes, it said that God made a deal with the devil. It happened many years ago. The devil reached out to God and then they made a deal. The point was whether Faustus, God's favorite, would become a corrupt man. Gino asked the protagonist. Who does he think won in the end, after all? The boy thought for a moment and replied that of course he thought it was God who won. And who else? Gino sighed heavily and answered that it was not so. It was the devil who had won, as unfortunate as that was to hear. Faustus had become corrupted and now his soul was completely subject to the devil. And the god had lost the bargain. It was a fateful moment. In the end, Faustus lost his life, but that's it in a nutshell. The story is actually full of so many metaphors. The friends stood opposite each other. Gino asked the protagonist, does he still think Faust is a fictional character? 300 years have passed and the devil has appeared before him. Isn't that proof? A guy walked up to the protagonist and putting his hand on his shoulder quietly asked him what he thought it could mean, especially since the devil had given him the power. The boy hesitated. He was not sure of his answer and he himself did not know the answer to this question. Gino said he wasn't sure himself, but he had a hunch that might be true. He looked at the main character and said he thought Faustus was reborn in this world, and history was soon about to repeat itself. Does it seem to me that he has something to do with it? Nothing happens in this world by chance. Everything that happens is connected to the destiny of man. The same contract with Mephisto, for example, was his inevitable fate. It was impossible to get rid of it. Everything that happens, sooner or later, would have been destined. Gino took a glass of milkshake. He sighed heavily and said that he's saying something too much, so he needs to stop. Too much information. He doesn't know exactly what the main character's powers are, but definitely, he's already an unusual person. The guy takes aim and aptly throws the cocktail glass right into the trash can, but the more the guy uses it, the more he loses. So he better think about how he's going to get rid of that curse. The guy was happy because he was able to throw it so aptly. The main character kept looking at him and trying to digest all the information he had just heard. Gino had to go now. He waved to his friend and said he was going to see him later at school, and the boy thanked him for the cocktail. The protagonist waved him off and remained standing in the same spot. The boy was left all alone with his thoughts. He sat down on a low fence and began to ponder. Faust, to the left of the fan. He was too confused. All this information was just overwhelming his head, and he needed to get his thoughts in order. What does all of this even mean? These are some kind of biblical parables. The boy lifted his head up and thought about it. Sadly, he thought about the fact that it seems like he was meant to be a pawn. But how could he be? Suddenly a thought crossed his mind. That's right. He had been too cruel to Dongjo. He had to apologize to him later. The guy went to his house. It was already too late outside. Galwa sat together with his wards in some corner and smoked. A whole cloud of smoke had formed there. Young laughed and remembered that incident at school. He was definitely getting soft right now. How could he get beaten by such a weakling? He would never leave the house again if he were him. Z continued to smoke silently and stare ahead. He was thinking about everything that had happened, and he couldn't get out of his head the fact that Mark had somehow managed to resurrect him. What the hell had happened? The guys continued to talk among themselves, Young asked the fat man. But he didn't find this toad strange. Somu looked at his friend in surprise. What is he even saying? The guy went on. He said this frog was never like that, calling this brat a savior and a piece of shit. The guy took another drag on his cigarette and let out clumps of waterbush smoke, and told them that they were all going to die. He must have gotten a lot of pleasure saying that to them. Suddenly the same fat man appeared on the corner. Well, it's not like we were just thinking about him. Here he comes. The fat man called out to them and began to approach them quickly. Young was getting a little angry. How did he even have the nerve to come to them? Why the hell did he come here? Get the hell out of here. But the fat man wasn't going to back down. He asked them in a trembling voice to listen to him. That goes for them too. Jung swung around and punched the fat man in the face with all his might. There was a scathing blow, and the fat man's glasses even flew off his nose. What the hell is wrong with him? And he wants to get beaten up again? The fat man was lying on the floor, trying in vain to find his glasses. He kept shaking his voice and begging the guys to listen to him. He finally found his glasses and put them back on us. Moisture they didn't break. Suddenly, Fatty said a phrase that left the guys shocked. Kneeling down, he bowed even lower and began to beg them to help him avenge Junho for such humiliation. Galwa heard all this, and rising from his seat with slow, measured steps began to approach closer and closer. The two boys kept mocking the fat man and telling him to get out of here at last. They were already anticipating that they would beat him up again. Jung looked at the fat man with hatred and was ready to destroy him on the spot. He was beginning to be annoyed by the toad's intrusiveness. Suddenly the boys heard the heavy footsteps of their leader behind them and immediately parted in fear. He came closer and closer to them, and now he was almost level with the fat man. He approached the fat man and called him Toad. The poor man looked at him and realized that now he was in trouble. His eyes filled with tears and his whole body shook with fear. Galwa stood in front of him, looking down at him. Now the boy could see with his own eyes just how huge he was compared to him. The boy looked at him as if he were a giant and was already ready to take the blows. But suddenly something unexpected happened. Instead of beating the fat man, the man walked up to him and smiling said that he was ready to listen to what he had to say. A big smile appeared on the man's face. Young spread his hands and began to shout, "Are they going to listen to this frog? And why should they help this trash? It's just humiliating. Why should they even listen to this freak?" Galwa rose to his feet and turned to his comrade in arms. He wouldn't stop raving. He didn't like the fact that they were listening to a freak. Galwa turned to him and said in a quiet, ingratiating voice that if he didn't shut his mouth, he would break his leg as well as Kenjin's. His expression was as if he was ready to devour them. The guy started waving his hands and fearfully saying that it was all right. He didn't think that Z would get so angry. The guy really didn't want to incite his anger on himself. The fat guy tried to hold back his laughter, but he failed, and a small chuckle escaped through his lips. Jung noticed this and looked at the fat man with an angry look. He really didn't like it when someone laughed at him, especially in front of his friends. He looked at the fat man and shouted, "Does he dare to laugh at him?" The fat man noticed this and waved his hands to make some excuse. He wasn't laughing at him, it's true, but the boy was already incredibly angry. He clenched his hand into a fist and prepared for another beating. Yes. Is he saying Jung's lying? Is he trying to get his ass kicked again? Galwa had had enough of this, so he leaned back. Suddenly he made a sudden jerk and grabbed him by the neck so hard that all he could get out of his mouth was a strangled wheeze. He certainly hadn't expected that, and now he was flying into the wall. After a few seconds he hit the wall hard with his back to the wall, and his breathing became ragged. Galva was holding him tightly, and the boy didn't have enough air to breathe properly. He moved closer to his ward and said quietly, "He told everyone to shut up, didn't he? So why am I making him say it twice?" He squeezed his hand even tighter on the guy's neck, and the guy wheezed from lack of oxygen. Jung clung to his arm with all his might to free himself somehow, but his comrade's grip was ironclad. He apologized and begged him to let go, or he would die. Galwa looked at him with his frenzied gaze. It seemed as if he was about to turn into a door. At least there was nothing human left inside him any longer. Soon he did let go of his comrade, and the guy slid down the wall with a clatter. Now he shifted his gaze to the fat man and asked, "So why does he want this freak to get what he deserves? He's just looking for some bait. How does he like that idea?" The fat man kept looking at his feet and started muttering under his breath that the freak thinks he's better than him. He even tried to hit him. So that's why a loser like him should stay a loser, isn't that right? Somu looked at his comrade and asked, "What are they going to do? Are they going to help him?" Galwa smiled and asked, didn't he think it was funny? He had never seen two weaklings hate each other so much. After all, they would get a chance to look at a pretty funny picture. The guy squatted down in front of the fat man and said he would help him. He would. The victim was very happy. In his voice appeared inexpressible happiness. He himself did not believe that the main thunderstorm of the school would now help him. But there was one condition. Galva patted him hard on the cheek and said that Fatty must help him. Fatty wondered how he would help them. But he immediately agreed, realizing that he had little choice. So he immediately agreed to help them in any way he could. And now, he really wanted to avenge his humiliation, so he would turn even to the devil himself. Which is exactly what he did at that moment. Galwa stretched in a wide smile. He was anticipating a great sight. Now he had another 6 in his auxiliaries, and it was a great opportunity to avenge his humiliation on this little freak. Junho and Yoonhee, the school buildings. She sighed heavily. She's so tired she enjoys drawing, but it takes a very long time to concentrate. Good thing she doesn't have problems with other subjects. The guy was walking beside her. That's right, she's right. But he's not doing well in his studies. The guy laughed nervously, looked up and sighed heavily. She said she was really worried that she just didn't have any talent in drawing. Junho caught up and tried to cheer her up. He said in a trembling voice that the most important thing was not talent but practice. He wasn't doing well at first either. His cheeks suddenly turned red again. He was always shy when talking to a girl. At least he thinks so. He's been practicing every day because he wanted to become a better mangaka. And then, he noticed his skills improving. He feels like people are born without talent. He comes with practicing. The girl looked at him in surprise. She moved closer to the boy and looked into his eyes in surprise. Wow. She didn't know a boy could talk like that. The boy was too late to notice the girl too close to him and blushed even more. He said he was sure she could do better. The girl laughed. Is he really flirting with her now? The guy got embarrassed again, and in a stammering voice hurriedly apologized. They continued to walk home together like that. Suddenly the protagonist felt with his back that someone was following them. They were two unidentifiable figures. The boy turned back and began to look around cautiously. It was darkness all around, so it could be anyone. One had to be careful. Meanwhile, two unfamiliar figures continued to follow our heroes with quick steps. The sounds of their footsteps echoed through the empty street. The guys continued to walk forward. The girl did not even seem to notice that they were already being followed. They kept talking amongst themselves. The protagonist felt and heard everything perfectly well. He listened to every step behind him, and was already preparing for the fact that they might be attacked by someone. Yoonhee continued to talk nonstop. Her loud voice echoed throughout the street. The girl didn't seem to notice anything around her. Suddenly, the guy squeezed the girl's hand tightly. He literally felt the girl twitch in surprise. She looked at her friend in surprise and asked, "Why was it he grabbed her hand?" The boy turned to her, his voice sounding worried and wary. He hissed that if he said run, this girl should run and not look back. She looked at him with eyes full of incomprehension. What was even going on? She saw on his face an expression of fright and readiness for the worst. The boy stared back with his whole eye, cold sweat dripping down his face, as if he could feel with his back that two strangers were approaching them. He felt that there were still literally a couple of dozen meters to go. The people quickened their steps. They were two adult figures. He could tell from their footsteps. They were loud. The people who were approaching them were quite mature. Not a few seconds later, the guy grabbed the girl's arm even tighter and yelled for offense. He rushed forward, pulling the girl with him. Before she had time to realize anything, she ran after him. Yoonhee, running after him and breathing heavily, asked what was going on. The girl was very scared. Why are they running away? What is even going on? But she didn't stop hurting, following her friend. The guy, panting from running, replied that someone was chasing them. As soon as the girl heard that, she got really scared. What? Who? They continued to run, the rumbling sounds of their footsteps echoing throughout the street. Gasping, the protagonist replied that he himself had no idea, but they had to run. They continued to run faster and faster, trying to get away from the unknown pursuers. Soon, the two of them were standing quite far away, in some corner between buildings and breathing heavily. The boys bent in half and tried to get their breathing in order. Yunhee stood beside the boy, and breathing heavily said that she was already completely out of breath. The main character said that he thought that they were torn away from these people, whoever they were. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked who they were after all. Gopniks? Were they trying to rob them? The guy looked at the girl and replied that he didn't know. It was hard to see, but his instincts were telling them to run away. He had never been let down by that sixth sense yet. Suddenly, the guy's face changed. He saw something and heard a familiar voice call his name. The boy listened even better. The voice seemed very vaguely familiar. Indeed, it was Dongyo, but what was he doing here? The fat man was peering out from around the nearest corner, and with an inviting gesture told the boy to come closer. But for some reason, Fatty himself did not come out. He just looked at the protagonist and kept waving his hand, inviting the boy to come closer. He himself did not come out from behind the corner, but only looked at him with the big glasses of his glasses. The protagonist wondered, what's he doing here? Why is it so late and he's not home yet? He was about to approach his friend and even took a few steps towards him. But suddenly he was stopped. He felt the girl take hold of his arm and pull him back lightly. She looked at him with a concerned look and told him not to go there, for she had a very bad feeling about it. After all, what did he want? The boy looked at her with a surprised look and smiled nervously. He told the girl not to worry. He would be perfectly fine. He should apologize to him after all. Dongjo might look creepy, but it's okay. It's just him. The guy asked her to wait for a couple minutes while he went to the front. The girl looked after him with a concerned look. She was already plagued with doubts about this. What was Fatty doing here after all? It all looked rather strange. She wanted to stop him again and even stretched out her hand towards the boy, but he did not listen to her and just walked forward with a confident gait. The girl could not stop him. She bit her lip and literally physically realized that this did not bode well. Very worried not only for her life, but for the life of her friend. Who knows what this Fatty was up to? In the end, the girl prepared herself for the worst-case scenario. At this time, the protagonist unsuspectingly approached towards his comrade. The fat man stood some distance away and looked at the protagonist with a chuckle. Lowering his head, the boy approached his comrade. Fatty also looked upset for some reason. The boy had already prepared to apologize. He felt guilty before him after all. Lowering his head, the protagonist said that he was very sorry because of what happened. That day, he had done wrong. The boy apologized sincerely, but his voice trembled for some reason. He had to help him. He knew what was happening to him. The fat man looked at him with an attentive gaze and listened to every word. His face expressed exactly nothing. He just stared at the protagonist with the panes of his large glasses. Suddenly, a snide smile appeared on his chubby face. He grinned and asked, "What?" He thought his apology would fix everything. The fat man lowered his head and ordered the protagonist to stop apologizing. After all, it was already too late. He lowered his head and continued to stare in front of him with a dumb look. The protagonist didn't understand anything. An extreme degree of worry appeared on the boy's face. He asked the fat man what he was talking about. The boy grinned and asked if he thought there was a price to pay for what he had done. Behind his back, the fat man was already holding a huge bat, ready to hit his assailant. The fat man was already cheering inside. He would finally get even for all his wrongs. Suddenly, the boy heard a startled shriek from the girl. He turned around to that side and looked over to check what had happened to her. The fat man was coming closer and closer to him. His eyes now looked like two big saucers. The boy was scared as he realized that something terrible had happened to his friend. It came to him too late that it was just a distraction. Dongjo swung his huge bat and through clenched teeth prepared to hit the boy right in the back of the head. Now it fluttered with him. The boy was too late to see the heavy bat coming. All he heard was the wind whistling. A second later, the protagonist felt a powerful blow to the back of his head. His consciousness seemed to leave him. Warm trickles of blood ran down his head. The guy could barely recover from the previous beating. And here it was again. Only from whom he did not expect such a thing, but from this innocent fat man. He looked at his comrade in surprise. Swaying, the fellow was still on his feet, The last thing he saw before him was the fat man's satisfied face. Finally, consciousness began to leave his head. The boy fell on his side, splattering a spray of blood. He felt his head become cast iron and his thoughts become confused. Finally, the boy couldn't take it anymore and flopped to the ground. The fat man stood beside him, blood dripping down his bat. The boy was lying unconscious. The blow was too strong. One could only hope that the protagonist would only get off with a loss of consciousness and a concussion. The blow was indeed powerful. At this time, Fatty stood looking at his victim. He had finally gotten even with him, his lips stretched out in a smile. Fatty was incredibly happy that he would finally get revenge on this traitor for betraying his friendship and not helping him in his time of need. The protagonist didn't understand why his head hurt. Why couldn't he move? His eyes snapped open and the boy felt that he was bound. His mouth was tied with some obscure cloth, but tied very tightly. He could hardly breathe. He was very much frightened. He noticed with horror that his whole body was tied with some ropes and started wriggling like a worm, trying to get free somehow. What's going on? Why is he all tied up? What the fuck? His mouth is taped shut. Who thought of that? But the worst was yet to come. Suddenly, the guy saw something terrible. Something that made him even more scared. He saw Yun-hee. The girl was also lying unconscious a few meters away from him. The guy mewled and tried to free himself to help his friend. He saw the girl lying unconscious. Some man appeared next to him. He asked the boy, "Is he up yet?" The boy recognized the voice. He shook his head, refusing to believe it. Rolling over onto his back, he saw a familiar shape. Before him stood his nightmare. Galwa asked in a satisfied voice, how did he like their surprise? He looked at the boy with that predatory look and his mouth contorted into a smile. It was obvious that the boy was very happy to see him, except that this joy didn't bode well for our protagonist. Smiling, the man said that he was incredibly happy to see him, small as it was. A thunderous laughter broke out. What a beautiful picture. Two losers and a sympathetic wench gathered in this beautiful place. The girl was also bound hand and foot. Standing next to them was the same fatty. He was looking fearfully at the protagonist. Galwa said there was nothing to worry about. He had, after all, bound him hand and foot so that he could not cut himself. The boy turned around and found that he could not move at all. She came close to him and grasped his hair. He moved closer to his face and said that they wouldn't let him use those fucking powers this time. All the boy could do was moan. The man's face was full of anticipation. He just couldn't wait to get even with this little freak. So let's get started. A blissful smile appeared on his face. Galwa stood beside him and asked if he would like to see the little surprise they had in store for him. The boy started wriggling like a worm and trying to get free, but all he could manage was a moan. The man shifted his irritated eyes to him and looked at him. There wasn't an ounce of pity in those eyes, only a sincere desire to avenge his humiliation. Galwa swung his leg and kicked the boy in the stomach with all his might. He just screamed, but the duct tape hid his scream. The man continued to punch him in the stomach. An incredible pain was spreading through the boy's body, but he couldn't do anything. He just stared forward in front of him with frightened eyes. He realized that he was in the most horrible condition right now. No one could help him, and it seemed that now he was finished. Finally, the freak calmed down. He stopped beating the protagonist and left him alone. The boy's shaking body was left lying on the cold earth. Galwa laughed again. Oh yes. Is he having fun now, isn't he? He knows what he likes. The boy struggled to get free. The devil. His whole mouth is taped shut, but he could use his fingers. The boy squeezed the phalanges of his fingers as hard as he could to try to break them. There was a slight crunch. Galwa naturally noticed all this and stepped on the boy's head. No way. He wouldn't let him use those tricks. The guy stepped on the boy's head with great force and a ringing sound was heard in his head. He told the main character that if he used his powers, his girlfriend wouldn't leave here whole. The boy looked at him with a frightened look. More than anything, he didn't want Yun-hee to get hurt because of him. Galwa stretched in a smile. There are so many guys here who knows what could happen. So let him think carefully before doing anything. Naturally, the protagonist understood what this freak was implying, and it made his body tremble with fear. Z loudly laughed. He can see that he likes this wench very much, right? He stepped on the boy's head even harder. It seemed like now it would crack like a watermelon. He looked at the protagonist and said he had to disappoint him. That girl would hate him after this day. He said the last words with a peculiar intonation. Yun-hee was all business somewhere in a corner, shrinking into a lump. It was unclear whether the girl was unconscious or just sitting silently. Someone was starting to approach her. Somu chuckled and pulled his cell phone out of his pocket. He was about to turn on the camera, getting closer to the girl. Z suddenly gave him a powerful slap. The guy didn't expect this, and his head snapped in different directions and saliva poured out of his mouth. Somu looked at his friend guiltily. Z asked rudely, "What the fuck is he doing?" In a guilty voice, Fatty replied that he wanted to take a picture of her. Z replied, "Is he an animal? Let him leave the girl alone." Smiling, he said that the star of their party tonight is Junho. He said it in a voice that gave everyone goosebumps. The guys looked back at the main character who was tied up lying a few meters away from them. The poor guy couldn't do anything. All he could do was watch as the two creeps approached him. Ze suddenly beckoned the fat man over to him. Tout stirred and got up from his knees. Why did he call him? The little fellow's voice trembled with fear. Ze suddenly embraced the fat man and turned to the protagonist. He said that he had hurt their friend very badly. As a result, he asked them to beat him up. The man laughed as he hugged the fat man. Junho looked forward in surprise. But why did he do that? The boy thought that it came out that Dongjo had taken offense to him that much. But unfortunately, there was nothing he could do now. Z turned to the fat man and said that they were done. Now it was his turn. The fat man looked at him with a surprised look. What's going to happen now? Suddenly, a powerful slap flew into his face. The kid seemed to spit out a few teeth. Z spared no effort. He asked the fat guy, "Is he deaf?" Let him beat him to calm down. The fatty fell to his knees and held onto his wounded cheek. Z already started to slowly lose his temper. Damn it, should he fuck the two of them off or just this fatty? He looked at him with an angry look. Dongjo immediately rushed towards the protagonist to finally beat him up. He really wanted to finally with the creep who abandoned him at the most crucial moment. The fat man sat on top of the protagonist, pressing him to the earth. He grasped the protagonist's scruff and swung his fist to finally accomplish what he had planned. Without wasting a second, he began to strike one after another. Wet sounds were heard. Fatty Bill without aiming. He hit his nose, his mouth, and his eyes. All the while, Fatty yelled that it was all Junho's mistake. They're the same exclamation point, they're no different. Galwa watched all this, and a satisfied smile began to spread across his face. He was incredibly enjoying this fact that two weaklings were fighting each other. Soon the man was bent in half with laughter. He was enjoying himself immensely at such a hilarious sight. Such a thing even he could not have imagined in his wildest fantasies. He encouraged the fat man, telling him to be stronger. Suddenly the girl woke up, apparently awakened by the sound of blows. Seeing this horrifying scene, the girl started to wake up, but the guy sitting behind her told her to be quiet, and told her to just sit there and watch. Here, her role was just to be in this place. The boy didn't look particularly friendly, but he didn't show any aggression either. Yun-hee blushed with fear. Tears appeared in her eyes. Still couldn't do anything, she just watched in horror as her friend was bullied by these creeps. Galwa smiled even wider and now ordered the main character's pants off. The main spectacle was yet to come. Young stepped closer and crunched his fingers. He was anticipating an incredible spectacle, one he definitely couldn't miss. Galwa was just watching from the sidelines. The boy came closer and with one swift kick pushed the fat man aside. He bounced like a frog, giving only a weak groan. Junho watched in horror as the two figures approached him. Junho ordered Som to move his legs away. The boy tried to twitch but was immediately grabbed even tighter. He groaned again, trying to break free, but unfortunately the guy's grip was very strong. All he managed to do was wag his head helplessly. Somu said with annoyance that he thought the guys still needed to be beaten. Galwa watched the whole thing with inexpressible pleasure. A satisfied smile never left his face. Now everything would be as he planned, and no one would be able to stop him. At this time, Fatty moved away from the floor and looked fearfully at what was going on. Someone present said to prepare the camera. Junho is a man, right? Isn't he? Somu brought the camera and started filming. Camera clicks could be heard everywhere. Young held the protagonist, not letting him break free. He angrily said that if he didn't stop, it would be bad for the girl too. Fatty watched this with horror, of course. This kind of bullying was not in his plans. After all, he just wanted a little revenge, not to go over the top. He had already beaten the protagonist. Now his conscience was clear, but what would happen next? What are these freaks going to do? Somu waved his phone in front of the protagonist's face. He said that they took a picture, and they also have a video. So from now on, let him behave better. Young irritatedly said that it was already time for them to leave. The guys moved towards the exit. Juno was lying on the cold pavement, unconscious. At this moment, he wanted to die. He was still bound hand and foot. Yoon-hee approached him and fearfully asked, "Is he all right?" Even though the girl was tied up herself, she tried to help the protagonist and remove the duct tape from his mouth. Tears ran down the protagonist's cheeks. He turned to the girl. His voice was very weak. His lips were cracked and dry. His face was also all streaked with bruises. All he managed to say was that it was all because of the girl. Yoon-hee looked at him in surprise. Her eyes were also moist with tears. She didn't understand anything, but why? The boy continued to lie on the ground and spoke almost in a whisper. The girl had already helped him free himself from the duct tape. The protagonist said that if she hadn't been here, he would have killed them all, but he couldn't do that because of her. The girl lowered her eyes and pressed her lips together. She didn't understand anything. What was this guy talking about? The girl was very hurt at this moment. What was she being blamed for? The fat man was still somewhere off to the side. He was sitting fearfully against the wall and looking forward. He began to mutter something to himself. Apparently, he had heard the words of the protagonist. The sight was truly horrible. The fat man began to stammer that this was not what he really wanted. The boy was lying with his pants down. His girlfriend was sitting next to him, and the fat man was somewhere off to the side. At this time, someone was already watching him. People constantly blame others when they are having a hard time and believe that it doesn't affect them. Someone's creaky and painfully familiar voice sounded. The little demon stood overhead and saw everything that was going on perfectly. He shook his head. The world is full of such cowards who think their actions are completely innocent. He enjoyed watching everything that was going on. Everything was going according to his plan. The demon laughed softly. That laugh was more like a hiss. Some struggle, some lose their way a point, but he wonders what he will do in the end. Will he continue to fool around in the end? The story was incredibly interesting. Or maybe this guy would become even a little more serious after all. The demon's face began to change, and instead of a small toy mouth, there was a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth. Mephisto hovered in the air and finally took his true form. A sinister, demonic aura emanated from him as he hovered in the air against the blood moon, which illuminated everything around him. Junho clenched his hands into fists. Apparently, he was very worried. He had a lot to talk about. No one would help him, but he was very worried. The next day, he was still sitting in his classroom. He needed to talk to the girl. He was very worried because he had said so many bad things to her. And it wasn't really her fault. 401. The next day, he was still sitting in his classroom. He had to talk to the girl. He was very worried because he had said so many bad things to her. And it wasn't really her fault. The boy shook his whole body and convulsively stared in front of him with eyes open with fear. He blamed her for everything that had happened to him. It wasn't her fault at all. It was all his fault. The guy made up his mind that he should definitely apologize to her. Suddenly, his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. The guy flinched in surprise. Surprisingly, someone had texted him. The boy took the phone out of his pocket and looked at the screen. From what he saw there, the boy's eyes widened with surprise. His heart skipped a beat, and his breathing hitched. He stared at the phone, unable to tear his gaze away. The boy snapped out of his seat and ran towards the exit of the classroom in a flash. The teacher shouted at him, "Where's he going in the middle of class?" But the boy didn't listen. He just ran towards the exit of the classroom. The teacher would have wanted to stop him, but the boy was too fast. Holding the phone in his hands, he quickly opened the door and ran out into the hallway. Junho quickly ran down the hallway. His legs wouldn't obey and his heart was beating at double speed. Only had time to make it. That was the only thought he had in his head. Soon he ran out into the street and ran up to the bus stop. There were many cars, buses stopped somewhere, and passers-by just walking around. The panting protagonist stopped and breathed heavily. He had made it to the spot after all. Now he stood and looked forward in front of him. Yun-hee stood in front of him and smiled as she looked in front of her. For some reason, the girl had bags under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept. Soon the boy was already sitting in the principal's office. Yun-hee had stopped going to school after this incident, and he told the teachers about what they had done to him. But the school didn't want to help him. Perhaps those creeps pulled the strings, for the school tried to hush up the case as soon as possible. The principal looked at the boy with an understanding look and nodded. He told him to put all that had happened behind him. The principal and everyone else had never been on his side. The man said he was sure it would never happen again. Yun-hee stood in front and the main characters looked after her and shouted. He called her name, but the girl did not respond. Tears of despair flowed from the boy's eyes. He looked at the girl with eyes full of fear. But unfortunately, she paid no attention to him. She stood with her back to him and seemed to be looking somewhere. She saw nothing and no one around her, and her gaze was directed somewhere far away. The boy approached her with a quick step with his head down. The girl looked at him with a smile. It was obvious that she was happy to see him. The girl waved her hand at him. Jun-ho looked at her with a surprised look and asked fearfully, "Where was she all this time? Is she okay?" The boy's voice trembled a little with excitement. The girl moved her lips as if trying to say something. It was obvious she was having trouble finding the right words. Her lips moved, but for a while she still couldn't say a word. Finally, she gathered her thoughts, and smiling, still shyly looking down in front of her, she said. She didn't know if the boy would talk to her or not, but she was very happy that the main character had come. After saying that, a small blush appeared on her cheeks. The boy didn't expect such an answer and just looked at her, clapping his big eyes. He didn't know what to say. For the first time in his life, a girl was paying attention to him. He lowered his head and stupidly looked down in front of him. The boy was gathering his thoughts and still didn't know what to say. He firmly understood that he should apologize to the girl for what had happened, but he still didn't know where to start. Maybe she didn't want to talk to him at all. The boy started to speak, but the girl didn't seem to be listening. She stretched and dreamily said that she liked it so warm outside today. The boy looked at her from behind and didn't understand anything. Why wasn't she listening to him at all? He didn't know what to say, and only looked at her with his mouth open in surprise. Suddenly the girl turned to him, and Zadornov said that it would be nice to go to the movies. There's a new movie out called Hello, the Essence of It. Should be fun. The girl looked at him with a joyful expression, while the guy did not understand anything. She must have noticed his bewilderment and stared at him in surprise. What? Doesn't he want to? The girl looked at him with big punishing eyes. As soon as the boy heard her words, he immediately waved his hands. No, of course he wants to. He really did not want to lose a good thread of conversation, although he did not manage to apologize to her. And he did not understand anything now, but did not want to spoil everything again. The boy was embarrassed again. What was on her mind? He finally ceased to understand what was happening. He had only said too much that day, and now she was walking with him as if nothing had happened. Is that even possible? She doesn't seem to be offended at all. Embarrassed sideways glance. Of course he wants to watch a movie with her. Saying those words, the guy instantly blushed with embarrassment. Yun-hee looked at him smiling, and fixing a lock of her hair, laughed with a caustic snowball laugh. The girl smiled and, squinting into her eyes, cheerfully said that now they're going to have fun. It's weird, all of this, whether she really did move away so quickly or whether she's faking it. Either way, there's definitely something wrong here. Soon they came to the movie theater building. There weren't many people there. Movie posters were hanging everywhere. Visitors were choosing which movie to watch, and there was a slight buzz in the hall. Our heroes sat in the hall where there were quite a lot of people. They sat on adjacent chairs and watched the movie enthusiastically. From the screen came a voice. This food is not for you. It's for the angel of death, and thank you for everything. The voice from the movie sounded menacing. Suddenly, there was probably some scary scene on the screen, and the girl clung to the main character with such force that he almost dropped the bucket with popcorn. At that moment, the guy was literally at a loss for words. The first beauty in the class clung to him in the movie theater. He did not know what to do. He only pulled his eyes out and looked in front of him. The announcer from the screen kept talking in a dull voice. The protagonist was pouring cold sweat from embarrassment. The girl looked at him and seemed to be blushing too. "I'm supposed to be dead" came from the TV screen. "You're wrong. You're gonna die now." The last words were spoken with a particularly horrible intonation. The girl apparently realized what she was doing and immediately pulled away from the protagonist, blushing even more. She apologized to him for such an embarrassing embarrassment. The boy said it was all right. He liked it. When he said those words, he turned as red as a tomato. Suddenly, the protagonist, to somehow smooth the situation, offered the girl popcorn. She agreed, and the boy brought her a bucket of corn. He took a small kernel of corn, and suddenly, unexpectedly for him, the girl took the kernel right out of his hands. The boy did not yet fully realize what had happened, as if everything was as it should be. Suddenly, the seriousness of the situation came to him, and he instantly became as red as a boiled cancer. He started pouring sweat, not expecting such an act from a girl. He was beyond happy, but on the other hand, he was terribly embarrassed and scared. In the end, unable to withstand the emotional overload of the guy, flopped in a faint on a neighboring chair. The poor girl was startled and looked at him, asking if he was okay. The guy's reaction was, to put it mildly, a little lackadaisical. Soon the movie was over, and the guys were impressed and headed to a local diner for a quick bite to eat. They ordered tteokbokki and rice balls. The blues were incredibly delicious to look at. The girl took a small rice ball and put it in her mouth with gusto. The taste was incredibly pleasant, and she even jumped up on the spot, holding her cheeks with her hands. Her cheeks were flushed to the max. It was obvious that the girl was over the moon. She leaned over to the main character just as he was pulling a napkin out of a small box. The boy blushed again. The girl looked at him and said that he really liked the tteokbokki. "A lot of people don't come here because they get them spicy here." The boy started stuttering again from embarrassment. He said he was a die-hard fan of this dish. It came out as awkward as possible. He took the chopsticks and put the dish in his mouth. "Well, they don't get very spicy here." The boy said he would go here more often. The girl looked at him with surprise and interest, continuing to chew her rice balls. She had a good-natured face. She looked at the guy with surprise. "Really? Then why is the boy drinking so much?" The boy looked at the fact that there was already a whole slide of milk cartons in front of him. He was scared. Where did this stuff come from? The boy twitched so much that he even dropped the sticks from his hands. Watching all of this, the girl laughed heartily. A blush appeared on her cheeks again. It looked like she was having a lot of fun together with S as the main character. The guy shyly scratched the back of his head and blushed again. There he seemed silly, and now he was embarrassed in front of her. Soon the day began to draw to a close, and our heroes needed to disperse. They walked down the deserted street and talked amongst themselves. Yun-hee smiled and said that she really enjoyed it. The guy looked at her and smiled and said that he was very happy to hear that. Suddenly the girl turned to him and asked him, "Did he really like it?" As soon as the guy saw this, he waved his hands and started to assure her that everything was just fine. As soon as he said that, he got even more embarrassed. The girl looked at him with a surprised look. The main characters all the time when he was walking with her, he was constantly embarrassed and acting silly. But it was very cute, and the girl laughed all the time. Yun-hee looked at the main character and suggested a very strange thing to him. "Go to a fortune teller." The guy looked at her in surprise. "A fortune teller? That's a strange suggestion. What would that be about?" Yun-hee was embarrassed again and blushing replied that she had never been there, and she was very curious about it. The girl realized that this is a very strange request, but still could not deny herself. The boy looked at her with surprise, and what does she want to know there? He just clapped his eyes and watched his friend. Well, he had no choice in principle, and he himself suddenly became curious about what would be there. So, the boy agreed. As soon as the girl heard it, she jumped for joy. Soon they came to a small building, on which there was a sign indicating that here works fortune teller. The guy looked at his phone and said he looked it up on the internet and it said it was cool. I had to go in and check it out. They went inside, and there they were greeted by a friendly man sitting at a table. He folded his arms in front of him and politely greeted the newcomers. What were they interested in? Love? Wealth? The guy sat down in front of him and the girl said that basically she doesn't know herself. The man took a deck of cards out of his pocket and said that they did not need to think, let them rest, and he would do everything himself. Yun-hee looked at the man and asked with interest what the future held for her. It was a standard question. The man smiled and said that was a great question. And immediately he began to shuffle the deck of cards, which with a cracking sound began to shuffle in his hands by itself. He spread the deck of cards in front of the boys and said that now they would see their fate. 3 cards must be chosen. The man waved his hands in front of them and gesticulated profusely to make the whole process more mysterious. Yun-hee began to choose cards thoughtfully. She poked her finger and finally selected the 3 cards she wanted. Junho watched all this and understood nothing. All these divinations were alien to him, for he was accustomed to rely only on common sense. He did not believe in God, and here there was some black magic. The man began to look at the cards and chose the ones the girl pointed to. Well, now he would see what they would show. As soon as the man picked up the card and looked at it from the other side, his face changed. It took on a look of horror, as if he had seen his death there. The man shouted that such a question could not be. At this reaction, the girl shivered. Apparently, there was something really bad there. Her expression suddenly changed and faded. Suddenly, unexpectedly for the protagonist, she snapped out of her seat and ran to the exit. The boy did not even have time to say anything to her in return. The girl as if no one noticed next to her. Junho rushed after her and tried to stop her. Soon they ran out into the street. The boy didn't understand anything and just ran after her. He watched the girl shed bitter tears, but he couldn't understand what was the reason for her crying. Yun-hee kept sobbing and said that she knew what the card said. She knows what's going to happen. The girl was sobbing as if she saw something terrible there, but the guy couldn't understand anything. Tears were running down her cheeks. She said she thought it would be fun, and it was just plain fun, but why did the cards show the same thing? The girl covered her face with her hands and finally burst into tears. The protagonist tried to cheer her up and came closer to see what he should do. Need to apologize to her now. The guy lowered his head and began to gather his thoughts. But what words should he start with? His palms were losing and his knees were trembling. This was the first time he had ever talked to a girl so seriously. Gaining a full chest of air, the guy called the girl's name. He looked up. He tried not to make eye contact with her as he was still very shy. The girl still had her back turned to him. The main character was saying that he was sorry that she had to go through all this. It was his mistake. He blamed her for everything. The girl listened to him silently, still with her back turned to him. So the guy really wanted to apologize to her. He looked somewhere to the side. His eyes were running in different directions. He didn't know what words he should say to apologize, but tried his best. He was interrupted and told he didn't need to apologize. The boy looked at her in surprise. How could he? It was his fault after all. He stared after her and the girl kept talking. No need to apologize, he's right. It's her fault he had to go through all this. The girl lowered her head and spoke through her tears. Her voice was so quiet that the main character had to listen. She lowered her head even lower. Her eyes finally darkened. The boy didn't understand anything and asked her what was she talking about. The protagonist punched himself in the chest and shouted that it was his fault. If he hadn't taken her down that alley, none of this would have happened. It was all his fault. The guy was scared to death. He really wanted to apologize to her and he didn't think it would turn out so badly. But what did she see on those race cards? The girl had turned around and was now looking at him. The protagonist asked her why she was blaming herself. Let her say something. He doesn't understand anything, does he? The girl looked at him with eyes full of tears. Her face wet with tears, all she said were quiet words of apology. After that, the girl rushed in the opposite direction. The protagonist tried to stop her, but she didn't listen to him. Only the sound of her rapid footsteps could be heard in the distance. The guy stood there, not knowing what to do. He had never encountered a girl crying before. Meanwhile, the girl was running madly. Tears were pouring from her eyes, but why? What was there to see there? The boy was left alone on an empty road. But what did she mean? Was he beaten up because of her? The guy stretched his arm forward and kept looking after her. Now, down his cheeks too against Lisa. He couldn't believe what was happening, he just refused to believe it. Not only was nothing clear to him, no, it was simply impossible. Yun-hee would never do such a thing. The silhouette of a girl who was laughing with such a carefree, ringing laugh appeared in his eyes. She would never do that. The guy tried to convince himself otherwise. He was now finally crying. It simply could not be true. The boy tried to understand something. What was she trying to say? There were many thoughts in his head, but not one of them gave no explanation for such a situation. Boy, on an empty road, there were almost no people anymore. The sun was nearing sunset, and its huge red disk was setting behind the house standing around it. The sky was a bright orange color. That was the last time he saw Yoon-hee. Soon he met her again a few days later. This time the girl was standing on the edge of the roof. The boy was not in time. He didn't have time to prevent the disaster. Now he'll blame himself for the rest of his life. He never thought this would happen. Now all that was left on the roof were her sneakers. Again he failed. Again he failed to prevent the horror. Again he failed to protect her. Now on her desk lay a huge and beautiful flower. But unfortunately the student was not there. This left a lasting impression on the protagonist. The principal coughed. The man tried to gather his thoughts to tell the children the unfortunate news. It was very hard to talk about suicide in the classroom. The man sighed heavily and leaned on the podium. In a quiet voice, he said that he was sad to inform the students that the head of their class had committed suicide yesterday. There was a whisper in the classroom. Everyone began to discuss the event and on what committed suicide. Is this a joke? The main character sat in his seat and didn't say anything. He just stared dumbly in front of him. No wonder she didn't come to school. Finally, the principal decided to stop the noise and smacked the table loudly with the palm of his hand. The man sternly said that he understood that all the students were alarmed by this news, but it shouldn't affect their grades. This man was incredibly pedantic. For him, there was no circumstance that could affect his schoolwork. Well, that's it for today. The principal said that the lesson was over and the students could go about their business. The children jumped up from their seats and rushed out of the classroom. The main character was completely devastated. He looked in front of him and saw nothing. All his eyes were closed, and there was inexpressible grief in his soul. He remembered how not so long ago he had walked with her, how they had watched a movie, and now this girl was lost forever. He walked over to the desk where their head teacher used to sit and looked at the beautiful white flower lying on it. At that moment, he wanted to cry. He couldn't believe it. Why did she do that? Damn it. There must be a reason. As he left the classroom, he heard several students discussing his pictures. The girl sitting on the table was laughing and talking about that guy's pictures. He was surprised to see his big dick, and they weren't laughing and discussing the event. The boy suddenly heard this and turned around to these wires. He looked at them from the middle of the class, but the boys noticed it and immediately fell silent. The protagonist looked at them with such eyes as if he was ready to kill them on the spot. There was only unspeakable coldness in his gaze, hatred for all living things. He was better off out of sight now. He walked out of the classroom with a quick step and slammed the door behind him very hard, so hard that the two of them even shivered in fear. What the hell? He shook himself. Did you see the way he looked at them? The guy started questioning the girl. The boy stood near the entrance to the classroom and leaned against the wall, trying to control his own emotions. He was having a hard time with it. A lump stuck in his throat. He couldn't cope with the tears that were coming. Gritting his teeth, the boy began to sigh heavily. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Slid down the wall and bitterly cried. Only his sobs could be heard in the corridor. There were hardly any people anymore. The kid was alone. Finally, he finished crying. The kid was devastated and completely exhausted, was walking down the corridor filled with people. He paid no attention to anyone. There were other students running around next to him, all of them in a hurry to get somewhere. The boy was inattentive, and one of the running students hit him with his shoulder so that he could not stay on his feet. The boy flopped to the ground, but he felt nothing. He felt empty inside. The same student who dropped him shouted at him to watch where he was going. His comrade exclaimed at him to finally go about their business. The guy was sitting on the floor, not moving, and these two began to discuss. I think they guessed it was the kid with the picture. The other boy laughed and said it was probably true. The protagonist looked at them with his crazy, cold gaze. It seemed he was beginning to suspect something. Those freaks hadn't kept their promise after all, and now the whole school knows about these pictures. The classroom was in turmoil again. The students could not, and were running around the classroom everywhere there was noise. As soon as the protagonist entered the classroom, Everyone became quiet and started squinting at him. "Look, it's him!" Everyone started hissing at each other for them to finally shut up. And without even paying attention to anyone, walked on. He walked up to his party and stopped in front of it, looking at it with a devastated look in front of him. There was something ugly again. There was a pile of books on the desk, something dripping from it. All his textbooks were scribbled with swear words and insults. His pencil case was smashed. The same swear words were on the desk. And someone had poured a glass of milk on it all. The main character just looked at it all. He didn't say a word. Already the hatred was gone. He had no feelings left at all. He was like a machine that didn't care about anything. The other guys kept joking around and laughing at his cock. One of them even suggested that they had gone too far. So what? He didn't need it anyway. The laughter continued to erupt in the classroom. The students were already laughing quite openly. The main character got up from his desk and moved towards the exit. Completely devastated and devoid of any feelings at all, the guy moved straight down the corridor towards the school exit. He had no hatred, no anger. He just felt like a nobody. He was nothing. He had lost the only person he had ever felt good with and who didn't bully him. Eventually, he reached the steps to the first floor and sat down at the top of the unsteady steps. Put his head up. He wanted just to be alone, to sort out his thoughts after all, otherwise he would definitely go crazy. Suddenly, he heard the teacher's voice. The man was talking to someone very loudly. Apparently, the conversation was really serious. The man stood there, cell phone firmly in hand, asking why this happened in his class. He got a fucking reprimand like he cared about his students. The man was pissed off. Someone on the other end of the wire was really pissing him off. Suddenly, he said words that took the protagonist's breath away. Why couldn't that girl die more quietly? But she was so cute. A gorgeous body for a girl. If I felt sorry for her. The boy continued to listen intently to the teacher's conversation. The man, as if not embarrassed, continued. Yes, that stooge in his class is a real pain in one place. The boy realized he was talking about him. He was only one flight of stairs down and he could hear everything. The principal didn't notice him and kept talking. He has no father and is needy. He can't imagine how many times he's busted his ass over this little guy. The principal was extremely annoyed. He didn't know if he was going to get fired because of those fucking students. Shit. Why did this have to happen to him? Well, you owe me lunch if he gets fired. Fuck this job, fuck this. The principal was talking to someone he knew very well. The boy's fist clenched in anger. The next lesson was physical education. Someone sat on the bench, someone played basketball. In a word, everyone was busy doing their own thing. The main character also came to the gymnasium, and he went to the boiler to get some water. He stood there, still staring emotionlessly in front of him, holding a small cup of water in his hands. Suddenly, a basketball flew right into his hand and knocked the cup of water out of his hands. The water immediately splashed him from head to toe. Now the protagonist was completely wet. The glass fell to the ground, the ball lying beside him. The boy made no attempt at action. He simply didn't care. He stood and waited patiently. From somewhere behind him came laughter. Nice shot. He was being mocked again. The boy shivered with cold, all his clothes were soaking wet. Someone said that this guy was walking with Yun-hee. The others laughed and naturally didn't believe it anymore. It's true. They say they were seen together in the city. Maybe that's why that girl died. Once again, there was an uproar throughout the gym. Someone said they heard she died because he fucked her. Yes, someone confirmed they heard that too. Shit. What a piece of shit. The boy listened to all this and his heart was filled with pain. Why do they have to be around him? He should just go and kill himself. The boy listened to all this. He didn't know where to go, what to do. Everything he had lost. Even that very fleeting happiness was gone from him so quickly. Somu and his friend were sitting in the bathroom, smoking as usual. They were discussing recent events. Even them was embarrassed that their main object of bullying looked so downcast. Somu replied that he would be surprised on the contrary if he was normal. Taking a drag once again, Fatty said that he didn't think that girl was going to die. The guy smiled and said that it was actually her mistake. She shouldn't have messed with Galva. Somu smiled and replied that there is, after all. That's the luck of the draw, I just used her. But that's not his personal problem anymore. The man laughed and stretched out in a grin. The other kid smiled and said that actually he'd once heard that this chick was the fatty of middle school. but she'd lost weight in the transition to high school. Lost weight, and thought it was all in the past. This girl, I should have been quiet. He doesn't even know where Galwa got pictures of her fat days. Once again, there was their loud laughter. That girl sure had a hard time. She'd become that brat's friend, and go to school for painting. The man laughed with a loud laughter. The protagonist was standing there in the back and heard it all. And why did Jay make this girl get close to the protagonist? The guy was still being discussed. Someone said, how does he know? He just had a plan, so he stuck to it. The main character was pressing himself harder and harder against the wall. He was standing in the toilet stall and he could hear everything perfectly well. Of course, the girl was faking it the whole time, so better to die so no one would know about those pics. Jay was at a club with his friend. His friend didn't believe the rumors were true. Did that kid really sleep with Yoonhee? Isn't that just crazy? He just showed up at the last minute, so he doesn't know anything. Many who think it's true. Galwa sat down next to him and said that of course it's not true. Is he completely stupid? The guy wouldn't stop. Then what about the rumors? He spread them, didn't he? But why? Just smiled. He replied that it was the best way to make that brat suffer. The kid couldn't believe his ears. What? That's crazy. Z leaned over to him and asked if he wanted to know. Why did he make her be friends with him? First of all, she crossed him. Second, he needed to keep an eye on this kid. 2 birds with 1 stone. And third, this guy had a crush on her, so it was the best decision. Everything was coming together just perfectly. The puzzle came together. And here it is in life. Galwa stretched into another predatory smile. He was literally physically enjoying himself from what he was able to turn this kid into a life. Just imagine all the slop pouring out. Nude pictures of the girl's death to add spice to it, or any rumor, even if it wasn't true. And now other rumors will spread like wildfire. There's no need to make up anything, they'll all make it up themselves. The guy sitting at the computer shivered. Oh man, dude. So he's not only good with his fists, but he's got brains too. Suddenly the kid realized that his friend was really freaking him out. Galva smiled and said that the best way to get rid of someone is to talk about them, and beating them up is a thing of the past. His friend laughed and said that sometimes he thinks he is the devil incarnate. The girl's picture was framed with a black armband. There were many flowers beside it, and in front of it all was a candle and 3 sticks of incense. The main character, dressed his all black, sat in front of her monument and pondered. He looked directly at the girl's picture, and inside he had the same all-consuming emptiness. His eyes did not express anything at all. He looked at her like a zombie now. For the guy there was no one at all, only that he was humiliated, trampled, and destroyed. Even his powers given to him by the devil himself could not fix such a situation. The boy left the room. He had cotton legs. His head generally could not think about anything. Near the entrance to the room stood several funeral wreaths, which probably bought relatives or loved ones of the girl. Nearby sat the parents. They were completely grief-stricken. A woman dressed entirely in black was crying, and the man sitting next to her, apparently her husband, was trying to calm her down. But it all seemed to be in vain. The woman was crying inconsolably. The protagonist stopped for a second and moved on. Soon the boy himself was standing on the edge of the roof. He was ready to jump right away. He looked down at the cars whizzing by, people walking by, happy people not like him. He looked forward, tears in his eyes. The guy didn't know what to do. He realized that even if he jumped off the roof, he wouldn't die. He didn't want to live. He didn't want to suffer. He realized that now he was all alone. Alone in this cruel world. Suddenly there was a familiar rustling behind him. The boy noticed it. He had already guessed who it was. A familiar face emerged from the concrete floor. It was Mephistopheles. As soon as the boy recognized him, the demon sighed. Oh no, he'd spotted him. The boy stood with his back turned to him, and in an indifferent, cold voice asked the power he had given him. How many days does he have left to use it? The demon smiled and replied exactly 14 days. But what had happened? What happened? The guy was starting to slowly scare him. The boy repeated, 14 days, that's a long time. I thought the demon had said he was just a source of entertainment for him. The demon flew closer to him, still as uncomprehending as ever. After a bit of silence, the boy said, okay, he's going to have a lot of fun. The boy is going to use all his powers completely. You won't leave anything behind. The demon laughed a nasty laugh. Our little boy seemed to have gotten a grip on himself. He looked with interest with his black, failing eyes directly at the protagonist. It seems that something very interesting is about to begin. At last, a worthy spectacle. It's going exactly as he'd hoped. The boy stood there staring ahead of him. Now nothing existed for him but the desire to kill. At that moment, the demon smiled broadly. There, God had lost again. The demon was triumphant. His eyes lit up with red fire. He was right again. Now the protagonist changed completely. His eyes were burning red, and it wasn't blood at all. Tears were streaming from them, but there was a crazy smile on his face. Now, he will kill every last one of them. Nothing else exists for him but the lust for death. Jae-yun sat in his bed smoking a cigarette. Next to him in his bed lay a beautiful girl. She turned to him and asked the guy what he was doing. The lad replied that he was just texting with a friend. The girl looked at him in surprise. What, didn't he text another girl again? At that moment, the guy felt like he'd been hit over the head. What is she carrying? Of course not. He's only got one girl, and it's the one lying in front of him. The guy tried his best to justify himself, but the girl didn't seem to believe him. Of course she did. Had he forgotten how she had caught him in the act of texting? Jae-yun reached out to her and kissed her on the cheek. The girl got embarrassed and squinted one eye. Yeji turned her embarrassed face away and blushed. All right, she forgave him, but because he was cute. The guy smiled and said she knew full well that he had her all to himself. Jae-yun, he told the girl to go to bed, for it was getting late. She obediently went to bed next to him, and in a second she was already sound asleep. The guy looked at her affectionately and squeezed her eyes. At first sight, it seemed that they had a complete idyll and mutual love. But suddenly, as soon as the boy sensed that his lover was already asleep, his eyes changed. That girl thinks she means something to him. What a pity. That fool thinks she means something to him. The guy collapsed on the pillow next to her and stared at his phone again. I'm gonna have to dump her somehow. She's a pain in the ass. He's hoping she'll give you a hot chain for tonight. But unfortunately, there was no one suitable. All the girls were kind of ugly. None suited his refined tastes. Some were too skinny, some were too fat, some had a Terminator face. Suddenly, the guy jerked up from his seat and stared at his phone screen. He'd finally found someone he was interested in. In front of him was a beautiful, slender, tall girl. On her face, she had a strange bandage, but it did not embarrass him, because she had a beautiful figure and a lush bust, and she was nice. Jae-yun smiled widely. Today, this chick would belong to him. In front of his beauty, no girl could resist. They started to correspond. It started innocuously with the usual greetings. Then the girl asked him to send her a picture. The guy sent her a picture of him lying in bed, and that was the end of their correspondence. The guy was worried about why this girl was not responding to him. He was starting to bite his nails out of worry. Why the fuck did she keep quiet for so long? He knew perfectly well that this girl wanted him. Answered that it wasn't bad, he looked pretty cute. At this point, the guy realized that they were going to have fun tonight. Jae-yun climbed up from the bed, and immediately his girlfriend woke up. She looked at him in surprise and asked, "Where is he going?" "He's going for a little walk." Naturally, it seemed strange, but the girl was blinded by love. The guy was already putting on his pants and replied, "He's just going to see his friend. It was no big deal." The girl planted a look of disbelief on him. She asked pitifully, "Wouldn't he stay with her tonight?" The guy replied, "It has been a very long time since he has seen this friend. Let her not be afraid. The guy will come in just half an hour." The girl excitedly told the guy to come back early. "Okay?" The guy nodded his head and pretended to smile. In his head, however, he swore at her with every word he knew. She wants a lot. Jae-yun left the room and waved goodbye to the girl, who waved back. And so they said goodbye. The boy creaked the door and dashed out into the street. The girl was left alone in an empty room and began to wait for her lover. She sighed heavily. She would be alone again today. Jae-yun was walking down the street looking for that girl. Is this exactly where she is? It's a little creepy. It's dark out and there's no one around. The guy was staring at your phone trying to find the right alley. He texted the same girl again and asked where she was. He'd already gotten there. Shit. What's taking her so long? She apologized and didn't respond. The guy replied that everything is fine. He came to the place, but where is she? The girl replied that she was behind him. Jae-yun didn't suspect that behind him, a strange creature dressed in a black hoodie was already flying at him. In the hands of the maniac was a sharp knife. Behind? The guy still didn't understand anything. Daejin was sitting in an incomprehensible place with his hands tied behind his back. The guy was out of it. He didn't understand anything. Finally, after a few minutes, he woke up. Drops of cold sweat were streaming down his face. The kid was really scared. Where was he? Who had dragged him here? Starkly, nothing was clear. He began to run his eyes in different directions, trying to find something that would explain what was happening. The guy started twitching and trying to break free. What the hell is going on here? He was scared out of his mind, his heart hammering in his chest, and it felt like it was going to break his ribs. I think he'd been kidnapped. The guy was worried sick about his life. He tried to untie his hands, but they were tightly bound with some tight ropes. What the fuck is going on here? The guy started screaming and trying to call for help. Now he was getting angry, just to get something to deal with the stress. Who's there? Show yourself. The boy tried to shout to the unknown kidnapper, but unfortunately there was no answer. He tried screaming to find someone, but unfortunately his cries went unanswered. By then, an unidentifiable figure in a hoodie was already approaching him. He was holding the same bat. It was an unfamiliar voice. Is he up? Because of the mask on his face, it was unclear what his voice was, and who he was. The stranger had a strange mask on his face. It looked like a hockey mask, but instead of eyes, there were two black openings, in which there was only darkness. It seemed to be the kind of mask worn on Halloween. The boy was even more frightened. He didn't want to die. And at the sight of this stranger, a legion of goosebumps ran through his body. His breathing hitched, and his heart began to beat even harder. The boy realized that he was in danger now. Out of anger, he began to swear. He asked, "Who the fuck is he?" At that time, the maniac just slowly, with regular measured steps, approached him. He held a bat in his hands and realized that he was the master of the situation. The stranger placed the bat beside him and came closer. He replied that who he was, it was none of his business. He said this with inhuman indifference. Jaehyun looked at him and tried to keep his composure. Though he mentally realized that he was at a disadvantage, he tried to keep his composure and not panic. The stranger came almost close to him and told him that it was all for later, that the boy would die today. However, he had just one question. Let him answer it. He has no choice anyway. The stranger leaned over to him and looked through the black failings of his mask. He began to speak in a measured manner. A few days ago, they tied up and beat up a guy and a girl. So let the guy answer him. Does he regret it or not? Jaehyun. At first, he didn't understand what he was talking about and just looked at the maniac with an incomprehensible stare. But then, digging into the recesses of memory, still remembered the recent incident when they beat this brat. I remember. They even took pictures, and then sent to the network. The guy smiled. I think he understood. So this is the trash they tied up, so ask for a sign, dude, but funny. The guy kept laughing. He had a great time that night, watching him shake in pain. Is he sorry? Is he laughing at him? Doesn't care about his suffering at all, you idiot. The maniac continued to stare at him silently with black, failing eyes. The guy kept looking at him and laughing. Isn't he scared himself? Does he think he can just walk away after this? Suddenly, the maniac started laughing. He bent in half and started laughing like he'd seen the funniest comedy of his life. Jaehyun continued to stare at him in surprise. Why is he laughing? What's so funny about it? The maniac continued to laugh harshly. His laughter echoed throughout the neighborhood. Suddenly, he stopped laughing and apologized. He'd completely forgotten to tell him. The kid is being looked at by his own fans. Jaehyun looked away in surprise. What had he done? The maniac pointed his finger somewhere to the side, and the boy looked there carefully. Goosebumps ran down his back again. If that's what he's thinking, he's in trouble. There was a phone in the distance, and apparently it had a camera on and was broadcasting live. The girl with the purple hair was still at home and couldn't sleep. She was talking to someone on the phone, apparently trying to explain something to someone. The girl was explaining that her boyfriend actually has a good heart. She understands everything perfectly, but she just doesn't want to hear. Suddenly, the voice on the end of the phone changed. She's a fool. He's a fucking asshole. After these words, the girl's expression changed. She was scared to death, as if she had heard a death sentence. The next day, everyone was shocked by the terrible news. Lee Shi-eun was looking at his phone, and a grimace of horror was reflected on his face. In the school, everyone was also staring at their phones and reading the news. Everyone's faces just had some inexpressible grimace of horror on them. In the computer clubs, too, everyone sat staring at the monitor and watching in horror. One of Galva's friends was staring at his phone and couldn't believe his eyes. He had a grimace of horror on his face. He had to inform his boss immediately. He rushed over to him and waved the phone around. Galwa, at this time, was beating another poor man. As soon as he heard the screams, he stopped and started listening. The phone stood with the camera turned forward. He was broadcasting live. All that was going on in the room was seen by many onlookers. Jaehyun watched in horror. He realized it was his phone, but he still couldn't believe what would happen next. Would something terrible happen? The maniac came closer to him and gave him a friendly hug. He gave him 2 fingers as a sign of peace, and he said he'd tell his fans goodbye. This was the last time they'd see him. The maniac laughed an evil laugh. Jaehyun tried his best to break out of the chair. He begged to be told this was just some kind of joke. The guy couldn't believe what was about to happen. Just let him say it was just a joke. Well, no, it wasn't a joke. The maniac got close to him and showed him the phone screen. No, it's not a joke, it's the truth. The guy looked directly at the phone screen. There was already a live chat open. Turns out it was all a setup. There in the chat room, he was being insulted. He turns out he'd always been a scumbag. He took it out on all the girls. Now the truth has come out. The maniac laughed and asked, how does he feel now that everyone knows he's a freak? The whole box he had in mind has been shattered. Is he okay in there? Maniac seemed to smile, but you couldn't see it through the mask. He kept holding the phone with the screen turned up. I mean, he can hear his fans unsubscribing from him. Well, that's just fine. Maniac cheered. Jaehyun screamed in grief. Everything he had built for years was now crumbling in an instant. His eyes were crazy. He realized that he was losing all his popularity before his eyes now. He was simply finished. He died before he was even killed for real. Lee had seen it all too. Who was behind that red mask? The boy gritted his teeth and set his sights on stopping this monster after all. It wasn't human anymore. The boy had lost his mind completely. He had to save as many people as possible. Now Jaehyun's girlfriend saw it all. She saw how the boy had deceived her. Now her eyes were opened. In the meantime, the guy bound hand and foot was screaming with rage. He was screaming that he was going to kill that asshole. Did he hear that? He's going to kill him. Suddenly, the maniac pulled a large glowing knife out of his pocket and swung it with the blade. The maniac swung the knife as hard as he could and plunged it into his chest. There was a delicious crunch. Blood spattered in different directions, but the man did not stagger. Jaehyun opened his eyes. He felt something light up in his chest as if 1,000 fires were igniting his lungs. It was just an unbearable pain. The kid's eyes filled with blood. He bent in half, and all he could manage to do was moan. The pain was unbearable, but there was nothing the boy could do. Not to be acquainted looked down at him through the mask now. It was impossible to recognize his face. But it seems that the reader has already guessed who it really was. The maniac was stabbing himself in the chest. But it was the guy who was his victim who felt the pain. Jaehyun didn't realize what was going on. Droplets of cold sweat were building up on his face. He could feel the hellish will, even though his body was completely intact. It seemed to be what Galwa was talking about. Devil. Looks like that degenerate is going to kill him. And he thought it was just a joke. The maniac picked up his cell phone, which was already dead. The screen was black. There was no more chat or live broadcast. He threw the phone aside, and it fell with a loud sound on the hard concrete floor, and immediately crumbled. The boy looked before him with a frightened look. He begged the stranger not to kill him. He at this moment just crazily wanted to live. He had already realized and rethought his life. At this moment, he was ready to do anything to survive. He pleaded, his voice becoming pitiful and trembling. At this moment, he was ready for any humiliation to somehow prolong the minutes of his life. Only now he realized how much he loved his life. The maniac paused as if thinking for a second. Does he want him to forgive him? The stranger took hold of the red mask and started pulling it aside. It felt like he had become a murderer. Pretty unpleasant, but it wasn't such a bad feeling. The man had already removed the mask completely. To get rid of the garbage, he'd have to become a killer. Now the masks were dropped and the guy could see his killer's face. Junho stared at him with his crazy red eyes. He had changed beyond recognition. Now he no longer looked like a normal person. His hair and eyes were red like blood, and in his mouth, he had many sharp teeth. Now how does the guy want to die? The guy said in a quiet voice that it's simple. He wants everyone else to just suffer before he dies, as long as possible. The boy didn't understand anything, so he asked him again. He yelled at the main character that the same wench was just using him. She's no different from them. So why is he defending her? Is he stupid or what? The devil! It won't make any difference if he tortures him. It won't bring that girl back to life. The protagonist just calmly looked at him, and his gaze was cold and lust for revenge. In a quiet and calm voice, he said that it looks like the boy is right. Nothing would bring this girl back, but there was something. Some strange blob of red energy appeared in his hands. He looked at his victim and said it didn't mean he should just sit there and do nothing. He didn't think so. Jae-yoon looked at him with a frightened look and tried his best to change his mind. Shit, boy. Was he really going to kill him? Eh? He doesn't have the guts. What would a weakling do to him? What can he do? In the hands of the protagonist, that glowing red dagger materialized again. Well, now he's going to see what he can really do. It's the perfect opportunity. The boy gripped the hilt of his dagger tighter and pointed it straight at his body. A second later, the sharp blade pierced his body. But as always, the boy felt nothing. Blood just spurted in different directions. His victim, on the other hand, felt everything perfectly. The boy sat chained to a chair and felt the pain spilling through his body. He couldn't do anything. It was like his stomach was being burned through. It wasn't just a cut. The protagonist looked at him with an absent look. He didn't enjoy the sight of torment. He was just driven by the desire for revenge. He needed to destroy all the filth and scum that lived in this world. Jae-yoon hid and gave a piercing scream. There was incredible pain in that scream. The guy felt like his body was being torn to pieces. If there was a hell, he was now in it. The protagonist pulled the knife out of his body. He was covered in glowing blood, as if he had some other glowing liquid instead of blood. Jae-yoon finally breathed heavily. Saliva came out of his mouth. He was out of breath and a little more, and the guy would definitely die. And he didn't want to do that. The protagonist looked at him and kept holding the knife a few centimeters away from his body. But he didn't stick it back in. He really wanted his victims to suffer properly before they died. The guy was already begging his maniac to just finish him off and not make him endure all that suffering. The protagonist looked at his victim in surprise and asked him, does he want him to just kill him? The guy plunged the knife into his stomach again, but they were just getting started. A satisfied smile reappeared on his face. His eyes lit up with happiness. Right now, the guy was truly happy. With the knife even deeper into his stomach, the guy began to twist it in different directions, thus causing his victim just unbearable torment. The poor guy clenched his teeth and struggled to keep from passing out. Strange that he didn't die of pain shock. Foaming saliva was already coming out of his mouth. The guy groaned in pain, if his throat only let out a deafening scream. He started squirming. The chair couldn't hold it and fell to the floor. He struggled to get free, but it was all in vain. The guy fell to the ground and continued squirming there. Junho had removed his hood, and now his victim could get a full view of his tormentor. The boy had already changed completely. It was as if he had grown in this short time. The protagonist smiled. Well, now he thought this guy was a bit chilled. Though one had to admit he was pretty tough. The guy didn't give up and kept fighting. He was holding on to life from the last of his strength. Jae-yoon lying on the ground and spitting up blood and saliva dots to wring hell in his fucking mouth. The guy was already breathing from the last of his strength. Shit, he's not just gonna get off. Well, the protagonist said he underestimated him. Well, that's just his fault. Looks like they're going to have to go to the next level. Just let the guy wait a little longer. The victim looked at his maniac with eyes full of terror. So it's not over yet. In a frightened voice, the guy asked him what the guy was going to do. Damn it, this is scary. At this time, the maniac just didn't listen to him. He went about his business with an easy, measured step. The protagonist was humming a simple tune to himself. He was rummaging through some things as if searching for something. Finally, he found the right tools. There was a hacksaw, a screwdriver, some drills, in a word. Construction tools. Now he's gonna have some real fun. What good is one knife? The guy was watching him, still frantically trying to get out. He's a fucking psycho. For one thing, he was starting to get a little good at it. He began to tear with his fingernails the duct tape that was tied around him. Yeah, until that psycho finished him off. He finally managed to free himself. and struggling to gather his will into a fist, he headed for the exit. Frantically, he remembered to watch what the psycho was doing. The maniac was standing a few meters away from him and was rummaging through the tools, choosing the most suitable ones. Jae-yoon struggled to run. He crawled across the floor, fighting the bouts of pain. He needed to get out of this place as soon as possible, or he was simply finished. The main character looked after him and gave a doomed sigh. Where is he running off to? The boy was holding a hacksaw. The boy was running away, and he was already a few centimeters away from the exit. The protagonist sighed heavily. It's not working out well after all. Junho realized that his victim wouldn't get away from him. But still, he was starting to get annoyed at his persistence. He took a large shiloh and aimed it at his ear. He said, "Stop, so let them stop." The guy took good aim right at the eardrum and prepared to pierce his ear. A few more centimeters and the sharp end of the awl would pierce his eardrum. Only a few millimeters to go. And lo and behold, Ji-yoon's head was pierced by a tolerable pain. He went deaf in a moment now. He could only hear the noise of his own blood in his head. The pain was simply infernal. Blood instantly spurted from his ear. The guy couldn't stay on his feet and tumbled down the stairs. He hit his head and his hands, but the pain was nothing compared to what he experienced. The protagonist started summoning his demonic dagger again. He looked after his victim with some annoyance. Already, he wanted to test so many different toys on him. Stop running away and pissing him off. Jae-yoon got to his feet and tried to run away. Shit. Now he's just going to be the end of him. The guy gathered the last of his strength into a fist and tried to get up. Junho rushed right after him. He definitely wouldn't let his prey out of his hands. Even though the guy tried his best to run away, he wasn't very good at it. His strength was almost leaving him. Still, he was running. And as he turned the corner, the boy could hardly stand on his feet. He kept running forward, even though his head was ringing and his whole body felt like it was on fire. Junho peeked out from around the corner and had already prepared his knife to finally stick it in his side. He watched his victim flounder helplessly, trying to get away. The guy smiled even more and finally stabbed his knife into his side. Then he started stabbing himself harder and harder. Jae-yoon, though he felt a hellish pain, but holding on to his wounded god, he tried his best to escape. No. He must endure. Just a little more. Just a little longer before he was free. His life depended on it. He didn't want to be victimized by that half-witted boy. Soon he managed to get out of this torture point. He ran down the street, leaving passers-by in different directions. His body was almost completely weakened, needing to escape as soon as possible. Soon he stopped at a pedestrian crosswalk. The guy started twirling his head in different directions. The kid turned around and saw the maniac as running after him in a sprint. He saw this most horrible red hair. Several thousand goosebumps ran through his body in an instant. His body, drenched in cold sweat, still somehow managed to stay on his feet. The boy realized that now more than ever he needed to run away from this place. As I waited for the traffic light to signal, he ran straight across the street, even though it was green for cars. The main character just sat and watched everything that was going on. It's really hard to kill someone, only more so. A familiar laugh sounded. It was a demon. It was somewhere nearby again. Junho sat down on the road and looked forward doomedly. Is there something else like the second level? Last time, Galwa just wiped out all the pain and got to him. He needs something more powerful to take down his opponent once and for all. The little demon laughed his caustic laugh. This guy has more power than he believes. The demon smiled. Now he was truly happy. Now everything is going according to his plan. The protagonist looked at him in surprise. The demon hovered in the air and stuck it behind his back. The pain goes away after a while. The boy looked at him in surprise. Is he saying that the main character can inflict real wounds? There was surprise in his voice. This was opening up a whole bunch of new possibilities for him. The demon smiled and said that he was a quick learner. The protagonist immediately asked, how could he use this power after all? The demon flew up to him and said that soon the boy would learn everything perfectly well on his own. The protagonist snorted. What kind of stupid answer is that? He didn't like it. It was necessary to seize this ability right now. The devil landed on his shoulder and said in a caressing voice that someday, when the time came, this would be a regular thing for him. The boy stared somewhere ahead with a blank stare. He was completely insane now. He was completely under the devil's power. The tattoo had already grown so fast that it had engulfed his entire arm, part of his chest, and even traveled to his neck. Now, he could literally physically feel it. Every time he used his powers, the tattoo grew faster and faster. He pulled a small Shiloh out of his pocket and prepared it right in his leg to stop his victim. Jae-yoon was running. As fast as he could, he needed to get away as soon as possible or else he would just be killed. The guy tried his best to cling to the last threads of life. Even though his body was in unbearable pain, but still, he was still able to move. Suddenly, some large horn, similar to those of real demons, began to appear above the protagonist's head. It came closer and closer to his head. The boy, of course, didn't notice it. Jae-yoon was running as fast as his exhausted body would allow. There were many thoughts in his head, but the one thing pulsed in his temples. To live. How he longed to live. The boy swung his weapon and aimed straight for his leg. The horn was coming closer and closer to his head, and just about to, it stuck to him forever. The weapon reached its target after all, and the poor man felt a pain in his leg that didn't bitch. He stumbled and began to fall rapidly to the ground. Unable to hold on to his wounded legs, the guy collapsed right on the crosswalk. His whole leg seemed to be burning with some kind of flame. The pain was spreading all over his body, but the guy clenched his teeth and tried his best not to scream. It must have looked strange from afar. The protagonist watched it all with undisguised pleasure. Jae-yoon lying right on the crosswalk, holding onto his leg. What the hell is this? This isn't a simple pain. Something had definitely changed. He looked at his leg and blood was pouring out of it. Now it wasn't a simple pain that goes away with time. It was a real wound. What did that kid just do? The boy looked at his leg and still couldn't believe what had happened. His leg was really hurt. It wasn't just a ghostly feeling. A real wound that was bleeding. The main character stood a few meters away from him and just watched. He was looking somewhere off to the side, a smile slowly beginning to form on his face. He saw something that he really liked. Now in front of him would be an unforgettable sight. As the car approached, the smile stopped wider and wider. The boy looked straight ahead, right at the headlights that were approaching him with inexorable speed. Jae-yoon also saw everything perfectly well. He was horrified to see a huge bus coming towards him. The guy had already accepted his fate. He saw the multi-ton Mahina flying straight at him with a rumble, and now he was about to be crushed. He was looking straight into the face of his death. Because his leg was really hurt, he couldn't move. His eye began to twitch. He realized at that moment that his death hour had come. It seemed he had come out for this walk for nothing. A few seconds later, there was a slap and the guy flew many meters forward. He flew a few dozen meters and still slumped to the ground, showering everything with blood. The main character hid somewhere in the crowd, wearing his dark hood. There were quite a few of this crowd gathered here to watch the tragedy that had happened. It was new to everyone. It's not often that such accidents happen in the city. Frightened cries were heard everywhere. Everyone was shocked by such a terrible accident. He began to look around to see if he was being followed. His eyes ran here and there, trying to find familiar faces in the crowd. His gaze traveled to the scene. There lay the disfigured body of his recent tormentor now. He himself was covered in blood and lying on the road. Nearly all his bones were broken. Somewhere up there, a demon stood and happily watched what was happening. They were enjoying it immensely. His little apprentice had finally grown up and gone wild. A lot of fun. The demon laughed his nasty laugh. Suddenly, an incomprehensible voice was heard from outside. Said she could get another soul. He's wasting a lot of her time, isn't he? Brother is making her life very difficult. The demon laughed and looked away. Mephistopheles smiled and said he'd give her this guy's soul, but she'd get too greedy. The girl was still snorting unhappily. She couldn't believe it. She had to become a part in his game. He's so toasty. The girl laughed, but thanked him. She really wanted a body like this for herself. The demon also laughed. He said his dear sister had done a very great job and of course deserved such a gift. Now the dead Yuna's body was under Lilith's power. Her eyes were holy with violet, and there was some horrible demonic aura around her, sizzling everything in her path. Time stopped. Events were transported to heaven. Gabriel's cathedral. The monstrous towers reached upwards into infinity itself. The cathedral was bathed in bright light and angelic singing could be heard everywhere. Razied screamed. lightning bolts streaming through her whole body. The girl was on the verge of death, and the torture continued. She breathed heavily and tried to regain consciousness. Gabriel turned to her and asked if she could hear him. The girl answered him in a weakened voice. She was chained to some sort of cross, and her whole body was constantly streaked with lightning. The girl quietly asked him for forgiveness. In front of her stood a man dressed in a ceremonial white uniform. This was the Archangel Gabriel. He squinted his eyes at her through small glasses. Behind him stood several other angels holding spears of fire. He jumped up and flew up to level with the girl. Forgive her? She should be asking God for forgiveness, not him. Now he was ashamed to appear before God. He entrusted her with the task as a humble angel. Did she expect him to let this beast deceive the Almighty like he did 300 years ago? Or did she befriend it? Hearing those words, the angel was scared to death. No, of course not. She began to make excuses. She would never dare do something like that. To be believed at last. One of the Archangel's servants took up a spear and swung it around, aiming straight at her. How dare she make excuses in front of the Archangel? She must be punished. Gabriel stood with his back turned to him and waved his hand in denial. He decides who will be punished and who need not be punished. Well, let them calm down. The man waved his hand, and it glowed again with a strange yellow light, similar to lightning bolts. The man concentrated all his holy power within himself to teach his disciple a lesson. A few seconds later, the cross on which the angel hung lit up with a bright light. The pain was just unnatural. The angel screamed. Now, he was on the verge of death. Even in a place like heaven, Gabriel looked down at him. Enough with the reservations. He had rewarded him with power, hadn't he? And he couldn't find the one who had become Faust? This is not an unallowable oversight. Besides, the man he gave his power to made a deal with the devil. He can't believe she let the filthy brat humiliate him. She deserves to be punished. The man was just beyond furious, and so honor was hurt. Raziel screamed in unbearable pain. Her whole body felt like it was being pierced by 1,000 spears at once. She screamed that she was confused. It was impossible that she could not feel Faust's presence. But she felt a strange aura from her friend Mark, and she was sure it was Faust. Gabriel heard it, and then interest flashed in his eyes. Is the matter beginning to clear up? He waved his hand for the punishment to stop. Raziel fell to the ground exhausted. Landing on his knees with a thud, he let out a stifled groan. Gabriel adjusted his glasses and carefully prepared to listen. This time the punishment was over. He turned to his younger angel and looked at him with a stern look. Still chained at the hands, I looked up at him. He looked at her like she was some kind of trash bag. This was her last chance. If she didn't live up to it too, she would definitely be killed. Gabriel said with sadness in his voice that he would not be able to meet God, so let her make sure she accomplished the mission. The girl nodded in agreement. Gabriel threw on his jacket, and with a quick step went in the opposite direction. Angel remained on his knees, staring after him. The two servants holding their spears said they thought the angel was very lucky. If they could get rid of her, afterward no one would find even her ashes. May she be thankful that Archangel Gabriel took pity on her. The girl clenched her teeth. She realized that she was not in the best position, and if she made any more mistakes, she would be finished for sure. This time, it would take a lot of effort not to screw up like last time. Lilith and her brother were standing somewhere in the city. The girl was looking at her body. She asked her brother if he knew why she was so excited. She really likes this body. She wonders why the past owner didn't like this body so much. What difference does it make if you are chubby or slim? In her opinion, you can get a lot of pleasure from any body. The man turned to her. He could see her real appearance perfectly. It was a beautiful, beautiful woman in a tight dress, and she had 2 horns on her head. She looked incredibly seductive, and her eyes were as black as Mephistopheles's. The devil smiled. People think too much about their appearance. It's too stupid. It's all just a pathetic shell. It makes him wonder about who is really evil of them. The demon laughed again. It seems to him that it's the dark side of humans are easy prey for them. The demoness leaned forward a little. She looked out over the expanse of the city. Still, how she felt sorry for the little girl. She had gotten involved with Faust again. Fate had been so cruel. The devil smiled and looked down. He laughed. Everything depends on fate. Life always repeats itself, and this girl is just a victim of an evil fate. He threw his arms out to the sides and shouted, God, is he watching this? Let him only admire how beautifully things are turning out. He looked straight up into the sky with his arms spread out. God had lost again. He laughed an acerbic laugh. How pleasant it is to taste victory. Come on, boy. Let him entertain him properly. The devil thought of the protagonist. Let his hatred and anger loose, showing all those who turned him into a demon what he's worth. Staring at the world with my black, bottomless eyes, he expected a beautiful sight. Now, nothing will stop his charge. The guys were sitting somewhere on the roof, smoking. Together, where they were, there was already a small cloud of smoke. Young was looking somewhere ahead of him, his eyes expressing complete concern. He remembered the very video I saw today. That maniac had left a lasting impression on his psyche. He looked at that video. The maniac was looking directly into the camera. He seemed to have found his victim again. Or maybe it was just a recording of a past broadcast. He watched with his black, failing eyes that you could fall through forever. The boy even shook a little with fear. He would not like to meet this monster face to face. After all, he had seen perfectly well what that monster had done to that poor man. Suddenly, the cackling behind him was really getting to him, and he turned to his friends and said, "What are they doing here? Let them go and do something useful." The boys laughed again and said they were going now. One of them came closer to him and turned to the boy. "What's going on with him? Did he see a ghost?" The man laughed again. Jung told him to get away from him. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's fine." Still, something was troubling him very much. His comrade came over and put his arm around his shoulder. What the hell did he see? Let him drop it. If something happened, just let them know. They're friends after all. The boy suggested he go out somewhere not too far away to a bar and drink some beer. He knows a cool place. Jung couldn't take it anymore, and with all his might, he punched him right in the jaw. There was a crunching sound and splinters of teeth flew in every direction. He told him to back off. Fucking assholes. He's not their friend, okay? Let them go and drink with themselves. The guy moved a little farther away. The same guy who tried to cheer him up in the first place has gone completely insane. What the hell? Is he fucking crazy? So if he's introduced to Galva, he's a big shot. Did he just hit him? The guys were staring at him with dumbfounded looks. The purple hoodie guy got to his feet and yelled that he was going to kill the freak now. His yellow-haired friend stopped him and ordered him to calm down. It was an unnecessary waste of time. The guy wondered, but why should he stop? They could kill the freak right now. Don't let him tell him he's afraid of the squishy guy. They can take him down right now. His friend looked at him askance. What would happen if they did that and Galwa heard about it? What then? He'd just finish them off. Let the boy think before he does anything, and don't let him cry about being like Junho. Besides, he heard that worm didn't come to school anymore. The guy in the purple sweatshirt cursed, "Oh shit." He gritted his teeth and they went about their business. They jumped on their motorcycle to finally get away from this place and the trouble. They were riding down the high-speed night highway on their motorcycles. The speed was just prohibitive. It appeared that one more second, and they would just fly off the road. But the guys confidently kept in the saddles. It was not the first time for them. The guy in the purple hoodie asked his friend if he was mad at the freak. The guy replied that he didn't care how he felt. All you need to know is that he's a smart dude. They're all and still future leaguers, but this dude is still on a whole other level. They continued to drive at breakneck speed down the night highway. Shit, man. Why the fuck is Galwa hanging out with this wuss? His friend wouldn't stop. The yellow-haired guy replied that he was just bringing him money, so he could use the relationship. Roughly speaking, symbiosis. Besides, did he see what happened to Jayun last night? The guy's thinking. Yeah, but wasn't that fake? It looked like he was trying to gain more follower count. His friend pondered. Did Young Hwan look too nervous about this guy's death? Man, that could be true. They continued driving, gradually picking up speed. He was sure that kid was okay after all. He can calculate things after all. His friend replied that he was dead after all. He didn't believe him, so he asked him again. The guy repeated his answer. He said he knew he was angry, but let him give this guy some time. He may be a bad person, but he's looking out for them, which makes their life at school a lot easier. Just let him remember Jang Hoon, who took care of them when they came to their past faction. But let him remember that it ended when Galwa came. Suddenly something changed. The boy felt acutely sick and now his arms were weakened. His friend, who was in the back seat the whole time, got really freaked out. What the hell? They're going down. Indeed, the bike roared and started to lurch downward. The speed was just tremendous, so if they crashed, they would both die on the spot. And his friend, who was driving the bike, fell on his side, and his friend tried to revive him. But unfortunately, it was all in vain. The wheel of the motorcycle began to wiggle in different directions. One more second, and there will be a monstrous accident. Stones began to fall from under the wheels. The motorcycle began to skid in different directions. He drove on the road as if there was ice. After a few seconds, he did get off the track, and the two friends flew out of the saddle and flew forward at great speed. The motorcycle started tumbling on the road. The guys fell on the road, and one of them immediately smashed his head. The motorcycle began to wiggle like a Yule. In different directions flew sparks, because he rubbed against the asphalt. The guy in the purple sweatshirt was lying nearby. He'd lost his head, but he was still alive. All he got off with was a slight bruise on his head. As soon as he regained consciousness, he started calling for his comrade to see if he was alive. Who knows? After an accident like that, anything's possible. The guy started looking around. He turned his head in different directions as he finally spotted his friend. His bloody body was lying a few centimeters away from him. His face was almost completely shattered. The guy tried his best to shake his friend, but it was all in vain. The guy was dead. His injuries from the accident were incompatible with life. He seems to have broken his neck as soon as he landed on the floor. The guy grabbed his head and kept lying on the ground. Shit, how did this happen? He looked up. His face was covered in small abrasions. The guy still couldn't figure out how did this happen. What the hell is going on? How did his friend suddenly pass out behind the wheel? Suddenly his face was touched by an unfamiliar hand. It was wearing a red glove. The guy shifted his trembling gaze to the side. In front of his eyes was the same maniac who had so recently mauled one of their friends. The man couldn't believe his own eyes. His breathing hitched. He was scared to death, but still he could not move. In a frightened voice, the guy asked who he was anyway. The maniac replied that it was none of his business, and holding out his hand, asked the guy to lend him his phone. The guy yelled that he was talking some bullshit. Let him just call an ambulance or get the hell out of here. The maniac inhaled heavily. Through the mask, it was hard to see who was standing in front of him. There were only a few holes instead of eyes. The mask looked like a hockey player's mask. Suddenly, a strange object began to materialize in the stranger's hand. The boy saw it, and fearfully asked what it was in his hand. But it was as if the maniac did not hear him. He grasped the invisible dagger, and with all his strength he plunged it straight into his leg. He felt no pain as usual, but just watched his victim wriggle helplessly. The guy immediately grabbed his leg. He didn't understand anything. How is this even possible? What the hell is this even? The man hurt himself, didn't he? So why is he in pain? The boy grabbed his leg and said that he understood everything. The maniac can take him. The stranger sat down next to him and held out his hand. Tout handed him his cell phone. Good, it wouldn't have hurt him so much if he had done that in the beginning. The guy groaned even harder. Taking the phone in his hands, the man asked what his password was. The guy asked in surprise. Why would he need to know that? Through the hole in the mask, a frenzied eye peered at the boy. The maniac had changed his voice now. It was not restless, but overflowing with madness. He shouted to the man not to make him repeat himself twice. The stranger once more grasped his knife and realized that now to his foot to strike another blow. The fellow would do the irreversible and began to dictate a password. He said his password was 0210. The maniac looked at him and put the knife away in his pocket. The stranger unlocked his phone and started looking at it. Who the hell is he? The guy asked him this. He crawled farther and farther away to get away if there was no attack. Smiling, the stranger took up his mask and said he was sure he was very curious to find out who was standing in front of him. Well, he would find out now. He took off the mask for a couple of seconds, but even that was enough time for the guy to be shocked to the core. He recognized this man, and now his jaw dropped. The maniac put the mask back on and in a calm voice said that now he saw his face, and he had gotten what he wanted from him. So now there would be a denouement. He must die. The stranger looked at him with his black, hollow eyes. His voice changed and made himself mad again. At that moment, the boy realized that his life was in great danger. He begged to be left alone. What the hell? He prayed that he wouldn't kill him. What did he do to him? He didn't do anything to him. The maniac repeated his words. He really didn't do anything. It sounded more like a question than a statement. Is he sure about that? The maniac sat down beside him and looked off into the distance. He said he wanted to kill everyone who bullied him, but he's no different because he laughed while the protagonist suffered. This is not allowed. He pulled a small homemade screwdriver out of his pocket, which he probably sharpened beforehand. Well, that would be his main tool today. Too bad we can't have more fun. He looked at his victim with an emotionless look. The guy started to scream. He felt like his life was about to end, so he started to spew curses. He's just a fucking freak. So what? Why all of a sudden you thought you had to kill him? It's not like he deserved to die. Why is this happening? He looked at the maniac with eyes full of terror. He seemed to realize that he was the guy who killed Jae-yoon. He's a fucking killer. The guy screamed and screamed with all his might, but then he stopped like he saw something awful. A scream stuck in his throat, nothing more, he couldn't say. A second later, and there was blood coming off his shakel. Real blood. His carotid artery had been severed in one precise blow, and now the guy was choking on it. He only had a few seconds until the blood completely drained out. The maniac didn't even turn around. He just walked forward, scoping out more of his victims. The man he killed ran out somewhere in the distance, holding onto his neck in a futile attempt to stop the blood. Suddenly, the maniac stopped and looked at a motorcycle lying nearby. The guy thought about it. He suddenly had another big idea. This motorcycle could be a real murder weapon for him. There was no way to miss such a chance. Young was sitting somewhere in the rest of the box with the windows and doors closed. Hey, I guess he must have gone too far. Should I apologize to Jae-jung? He seemed to have a guilty conscience, but he acted on it. No, it was his mistake, so apologizing would be unnecessary. Suddenly his phone vibrated. It was a message from that guy. What? What, he wants to apologize to him? It was weird, but still he couldn't say no. He read the message carefully. The other guy said he wanted to meet at 9 p.m. at the same place. Okay, it's his fault too. It's better to tell him I'm sorry. It's the right thing to do. Soon he was arranged to meet together at the agreed time. But to his surprise, none of the other people showed up. Shit! A sign. Why did they keep him waiting? He looked around, trying to find someone. The guy started to shift from foot to foot. In the distance, he saw someone's motorcycle. This machine seemed vaguely familiar to him. He called out for those guys to finally come out and show themselves in front of him. Unfortunately, no one was there. He continued to persistently call out to them, looking around. He was getting a little creepy. He is alone in a foreign place, who knows where, and now they might be in danger. Suddenly, a vague figure dressed in black appeared behind him. It had the same mask on its face. The figure came out almost noiselessly, so that the guy didn't even hear her approach. He went into one of the rooms in search of these guys and started looking around. The maniac at this time was already waiting for him outside the door. He tried not to breathe so as not to give away his presence. The guy kept screaming, attracting more and more attention. He shouted for them to stop bullshitting and come out. The maniac slowly peeked out from behind the door, waiting for the right moment. Yeah, that's it, let him go first. The guy was holding a knife that was starting to glow, a little more. Jung had already entered the room close enough to be in the line of attack. Suddenly, someone called out to him. It was a familiar figure. The boy turned around and looked in the direction of the sound. It was Soma, he asked him. What was he doing here at this late hour? He looked at his comrade with an uncomprehending look, discounting one eyebrow. The protagonist couldn't believe it. Is he here too? What did he forget here? All his plans were falling apart literally before his eyes. The fat man kept questioning him. What was he even doing here? What needed to be done this late? Somu replied that he was the one who told him to pass. Isn't he a jerk? Somu looked at him and raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked what he was doing here. Did he come here to meet someone? The maniac was hiding behind the wall at this time and eavesdropping on their conversations, trying not to give himself away. He was barely breathing. A cunning plan was born in his head again. Maybe he'll be able to kill 2 people with one blow. Though who knows? It was still worth a try. The guy already had his knife ready in his hands to commit another murder. Yuan replied that he needed to meet Jejun and Wang Ken. There's no one inside, so he thinks they're still walking somewhere. It would be better to wait for them now and find out all matters on the spot. The protagonist hid behind the door and waited patiently. Somu laughed out loud. What was he thinking? These idiots are too easily distracted by bullshit. They always have nothing better to do. The guy confirmed. Yup, Exactly, and laughed immediately. He's going to the arcade? His hand glowed with devilish flames again, and demonic energy began to gather in it, so that he could finally create a knife to finish off those freaks. Somu said he would go and visit Kenjon. The boy wondered, why is he taking care of him? The fat man replied that just because their leader beat him up doesn't mean they should stop talking to him. He's their friend after all. Young grinned. That's who the little stooge beat up here, right? There was no way he was his good friend. Let it not embarrass him. Somu looked at him with a formidable look and asked, did he even realize what he just said? Had he forgotten? It was because of this man that he had met Galva. The guy immediately misheard. He was scared. Goosebumps ran down his back. No, he didn't mean that. He didn't, did he? He was very frightened because he realized that the big man would wipe him out if he said anything else wrong. Somu looked at him with a fierce gaze as if he wanted to wipe him out. But unfortunately, there was no fight. The fat man simply took a cigarette out of his pocket and lit it with his lighter and smoked it. He sighed heavily. Okay, we should forget it. The guy nodded in agreement. They stood and smoked while the protagonist hid behind the door and waited patiently. Shit. They're all freezing in that jacket. It's really cold. Still, they continued their conversation. One of them asked the question, where is that little bastard? It was about the main character. Young stood smoking and replied not to hover here. He'll round up the liggers tomorrow and tell them to find this creep. He wants revenge for Jayan. The boys took another drag on their cigarettes. Somu turned to his friend. Look, he thinks this little scumbag had nothing to do with it. Jayan just got hit by a car. It was even on the news. And he thinks they were too hard on him. This is really getting out of hand. They really went too far. Fatty got sad for some reason. If it wasn't for their antics, it might be Yunhee would be alive right now. He said the last words almost crying. His friend looked at him and asked, why the hell is he talking just like a loser? Somu hesitated and looked at his cigarette butt. He's just talking, isn't he? The kid looked in front of him. He said that he personally did not wish this kid any harm. They were only doing all this because they are followers of Galva. He only wants to beat up this monkey. He's only interested in this little bastard. He is well aware that the protagonist is responsible for the death of their comrade, but they are responsible for it themselves. Sometimes he wants to apologize to him. He feels bad about what he's doing. The protagonist, standing outside the wall at this time and listening to them attentively. His friend sighed heavily and reprimanded, saying that if they're done, it's time to get the hell out of here. They were already very cold and they never waited to meet up. The protagonist continued to follow them. He rasped his fists again. Apologize to him. Are they really waking up their conscience? This is just some kind of bad joke. The guy took that idiotic mask off his head. That asshole was enjoying himself while he was beating the last of the spirit out of him. He told them to stop, but they kept going on. The guy started to become overwhelmed with unimaginable madness again. Is he sick of what he's done? Is he ashamed? The guy took off his mask and breathed a full breath. The mask flew to the floor and hit the stone floor with a loud thud. The kid looked little like a human anymore, his eyes glittering with madness, and his mouth was filled with several sharp fangs. He'd never had those before. They were just fucking freaks. How could they feel wine? He would never forgive them. She's going every one of them, and she's going to kill them, send them to hell. He knows Yunhee is around. The guy's already starting to slowly become obsessed. Hwan goes up to the head of the Liger faction, and he says he has gathered everyone here as he requested. There were several dozen people standing in front of him. So what next? It was Yang John-hoon, the leader of the future Ligers faction. Hwan showed them a phone that had a picture of the main character on it. He said that he wanted them to find this stooge. He will forward the picture to them, so don't let them dare come back and say they didn't find him. The guy holds the phone up even higher and says that this creep is wearing the sinister mask they saw in the video at Juyun's, and now he wants them to find him and call him. They've only got one day. Well, they can get started. Now the guy's got a pissed-off look on his face. He ordered them to find that bastard and avenge the deaths of their comrades. Completely. There was a whispering in the ranks of the group. Somebody said they heard he was hit by a car. Who knows, better just shut up, that's it, let them start. As Hwan shouted at them again, Jan walked up to him and wanted to say something. He smiled and asked the guy, "This is his last request, right?" Hwan finished rummaging through his phone and asked in surprise, "What did he mean by that?" Yang, smiling, continued to talk. He said he thought they had paid for a whole year. And besides, he told them he had their backs if they waited another year. Did he remember that? But just then, a mighty blow landed in his stomach. The guy only managed to let out a groan and flew backwards, unable to stay on his feet. 479 Huan came closer to him. Who the hell are they? To tell him what to do, he told them they do it. For covering for them, he gets pussyfooted by Galva. Ian was lying on the floor, squirming in pain. Guy continued, "If they do that again, he'll stop doing it." Guy looked at him fearfully and apologized again, continuing to hold his stomach. Heaven looked somewhere to the side. "Just let them find that little freak, understand? That's all he needs." He turned around and spit on the floor and walked away at a brisk pace. Yang soon gathered all his subordinates and ordered them to look for the little freak. Soon all the boys came back out of breath, but unfortunately not fulfilling the request. Their leader asked, "Did they find him?" The boys said no. "He's nowhere to be found." What are they going to do? Time's running out. Jan got his head up his ass, damn it. Why do they have to look for him, damn it? The boy cringed and didn't know what to do. The time was running out and there was no result. Now he'd be screwed for sure. The guys, of course, noticed that their leader was very much worried about something. And even if he doesn't know what to do, it means he's not completely fucked up. But the guy tried to come to his senses quickly, and waving his hand apologized to the guys. He didn't have to show his weakness, they wouldn't take it lying down. His friends came up to him and said it wasn't his fault. One of them suggested we go and eat some chicken. They all agreed. Yang walked in the opposite direction. He was downcast and didn't know what to do. Huan the bastard hadn't kept his word. How much was it possible to mess around with that little creep? It was better when Youngjong had everything under control. The guy was walking forward and thinking about something. Tears almost appeared in his eyes. He realized how pathetic he was. He has to grovel before Galva because he's a weakling and can't take care of his gang on his own. Suddenly the guy shifted his gaze back, and from what he saw, it was like his heart stopped. A chill started to build across his face. He finally saw what he was looking for, but unfortunately it wouldn't help him now. His eyes bulged with fear, and cold sweat began to trickle down his face. Before him stood the very assassin they had been hunting for so long. He stood and looked at him with the dark failings of his mask. Ian took a fighting stance, but he doubted it would do him any good. He finally decided to show himself. He's crazier than everyone thought. Does he want to get rid of him while he's alone? Coward. Well, come on, show me what you got. The boy tried his best to be as brave as possible to reassure himself. The boy thought. He remembered hearing somewhere that this killer carries a knife. Is he using it? The boy shouted. Let the maniac fight just like a man. And don't even think about pulling out his knife. The killer looked at him and in a good-natured voice said he thought his wish might well come true. Ian continued to keep his fists at the ready, although he was a little shocked that the assassin didn't decide to finish him off right away. After all, he knew he wouldn't be able to stand up to him. To his surprise, the stranger approached him with a soft gait and put a friendly hand on his shoulder. He asked if he wished to hear what he would propose to him. Jan. Not wanting to hear anything, he yanked his arm and removed the maniac's hand from his shoulder. He screamed for the creep to back off. Well, he had chosen his own death. Gino walking out of the hospital, he cheerfully walked towards his home. Free at last. Free from hospital food and could eat as much yummy food as he wanted. The guy exhaled and steam came out of his mouth. Whew, it's cold today. The guy zipped up the zippers on his jacket tighter and moved forward. He walked briskly to his house, Google's footsteps echoing down the empty street, and the guy was in a great mood. Soon the boy came to his house. On the way, he stopped at the store to buy some groceries. Now he stood on his doorstep and called out to his mother. The woman didn't answer, so the boy, wary, called her again. The boy went into the next room and was about to call out to her again, when suddenly he hesitated half a word, for he saw the woman sleeping peacefully in her bed. The boy smiled and with a blessed smile looked at his sleeping mother. The picture was peaceful. The boy loved his mother very much. It was almost the only native person who could support him in a difficult moment. And now the boy directed all his energies to make her happy. Suddenly, someone's very familiar voice came to his ears. After that, the boy squinted his eyes and grouped his whole body ready to attack. The boy realized who it was in a split second. He clenched his fist and his hand glowed again with a bright, divine light. The boy turned, and began to walk quietly to the back of the house to see who dared to enter his dwelling after all. The boy swung around and without aiming hit the source of the sound, or at least where he thought the sound was coming from. To his surprise, there was an angel standing there. He stopped his hand at the last moment. His fist was already warmed up and was literally a few centimeters from his face. She-girl put her hand out and caught his blow. Surprised, he looked at her. What's he doing here? He looked at the girl in surprise. And what is she doing here? What brought her here? The boy certainly hadn't expected this. He was even prepared that this fat eye and breaking into his house, but not an angel. She gritted her teeth and began to speak. Her look was not at all unfriendly. The girl said it was time to tell him something. She was sure the lad had rested enough, so they would talk about his mission. They stood opposite each other like this. The girl was holding the guy's hand, and in her other hand she was holding a lollipop. She seemed to walk around with it all the time. Havan was frantically holding his phone in his hands and looking at something there. Drops of sweat were building down his face. Apparently what he saw there shocked him. And what are those freaks doing there? It wasn't my question that stuck in his head. He'd just kill them, wouldn't he? After that, the guy moves his head back, but before he does, Galwa kills him. Shit, he was going to lose his mind. He had to come up with some sane plan. Otherwise, he's going to get killed by his own people. Suddenly, the boy heard his leader address him. A whole legion of goosebumps immediately ran down his back. The boy turned to him and fearfully asked him what he wanted. Galwa stared at him with a waiting look. Why don't they hear back from the Ligers? Hadn't he said one day was enough for him? Had he deceived him? The boy looked at him with a calm and inquisitive gaze for the time being. Havan walked up to him and began to delicately speak. His voice trembled with fear. He asked the man to wait a little longer. They will find him. Let him give him just a little more time. It's not easy after all. This killer is not easy to catch. Suddenly, his phone rang. How BTW he's going to answer it now, and he feels like his problem is about to be solved. The guy grasped the phone with trembling hands and brought it to his ear. The guy started talking with a hissing voice. Apparently, he was very dissatisfied. He asked, "Did they find him? Why are they taking so long? What assholes?" The kid must have been very annoyed. A voice came out of the phone. He apologized and said that they ran into some problems. That was the reason for their delay. But now it's okay. They found the bastard and tied him up. Now he's sitting right in front of them. Indeed, the main character was tied up by the arms for some reason and was sitting on a chair. He was completely immobilized, caught again. But it seems for him everything was under control, and he was staring down in front of him. The gang leader finished telling his superiors where they were and invited them to come here and see for themselves. The boy continued to stare ahead with his head down. The guy looked at his prisoner and tossed the phone away. He was incredibly pleased that he had managed not to disappoint his superior after all. Havi pressed the call reset button. A huge mountain fell off his shoulders. He'd finally get to show off to Galva. He was already afraid he'd have to take a beating for not completing the task on time. He turned to him and told him that his guys had just called him and said that they had caught this maniac and he was at their base. He would go over and check on them and call him back. Galwa puffed on his cigarette once again and just stared intently in front of him. He let the puffs of acrid smoke out of his mouth and stared thoughtfully ahead. He seemed to suspect something, for this fellow was not so simple. Galwa got up from his seat and put out his cigarette butt with his foot. No, that's right. That little sod is pretty smart. He's quite aware that he's up to something, isn't he? There's no way he'd be so easily caught by that scum. They will meet him again when fate wills it. The man smiled a crazy smile. Things are going according to plan after all. Soon, he'll be able to get even with this little brat. On the roof of the house, a lot of people had gathered. It was a gang of Ligers. Guys were standing around talking to each other. Some were smoking. Some were just walking backwards and forwards. Everyone was a little uneasy. Their leader sat in front of the protagonist and, holding a cigarette butt in his hands, was interrogating him. He was asking the protagonist, "Who is he? Why is he doing all this?" They were sitting in some very cramped room that had bars on the windows. He just sat there with his head down and didn't say anything. In all this time, he hadn't managed to get a single word out of the protagonist. Now he was sitting in front of him, but it was no use, because the guy was silent. Jan looked at him, and there were bags under his eyes due to the fact that he hadn't slept for a long time. Still, the kid hadn't said anything, and now there was a new problem. How to crack him after all. Suddenly, the doors boomed open with a clatter, and Heaven appeared on the doorstep. He was in high spirits and asked where the bastard was. He was overjoyed that he was finally going to get even with the little guy. Jan looked at him from behind and said hello. Hwan walked closer to him and a joyful smile lit up on his face. Here they were, meeting again. Looks like he got some balls for a bit. Not bad, he even liked it a little. The boy looked at the protagonist and anticipated the reprisal. He walked up to the boy and took him by the hair, so tightly that the kid gritted his teeth. Did he think he was going to be invisible? Let him look at his hair. The boy laughed, because the main character's hair seemed very funny to him. That little degenerate is going to die soon. The boy let go of the protagonist's head, but before that happens, there's something else to do. Hwan approached him and asked with interest. He was the one who killed Jaehyun, wasn't he? How had he done it? He heard that the unlucky guy was hit by a car. So how did he have anything to do with it? If he was really planning this shit and came up with the idea that people would see Jaehyun shaking in fear in that chair, he fucked up big time. Did he kill him because of that girl? The boy gritted his teeth in anger. He wanted revenge. What did he get out of it? The kid was slowly boiling over with anger. Hwan looked down at him, already anticipating the reprisal. What was he going to do now? A smile ran across the boy's face. It's not like he'll be able to get out of here. All the doors are locked. It's crowded, and he doesn't have his weapon. Suddenly, the main character raised his head, and a crazy smile appeared on his face. His eyes glowed red again, and his fangs gleamed even in the darkness of the night. The boy regained his insane expression. Heaven even was a little scared for a few seconds. He pulled away from the boy and took his hand away. Did he think it was funny? The boy stood there looking at the killer with a frightened look. You could see by the look on his face that he wasn't the least bit frightened. Is he really afraid of this little guy? But then the guy went into a rage, started beating up the protagonist. He repeated his question. The kid thinks it's funny. The protagonist did nothing. He just waited patiently, enduring all the blows that fell on him one after another. Hwan kept hitting him, and the protagonist did nothing. It was all the sounds of scathing blows that could be heard. He can't sleep properly. Do you know how much shit he endured because of that little prick? Ian stood a little distance away and listened in horror to everything that was happening. A few thousand flies ran down his back for a second. The pleasant and cold guy gently took hold of the door handle. It was nice and cold to the touch. He covered the door so that no outsiders could enter it. Hwan continued to beat up the main character. He was screaming with rage because all that he had to endure. These days, it's just impossible. Who does he think he is? Eh? He thinks a guy can play with him? He was furious. Suddenly, Jan stepped closer to him and turned to the boy. The one stopped and his face changed. He was a little surprised to be interrupted in such an activity. He came closer to him and asked, he did what the boy told him to do, didn't he? So he'd cover up and let them go, right? Just like he promised. The guy looked at him with a look of incomprehension. After listening to the head of the faction, the guy replied that this was some bullshit. He had never said such a thing. Yang heard this, and his face immediately changed. It took on a mad expression as he was once again deceived. Hwan came up to him and began tapping his forefinger on his forehead. Now he would listen to him. If it wasn't for him, that lousy gang would have been smeared on the wall by now. He should be thankful they don't get beaten up every day outside the school. Where's his thanks? Ian tilted his head to the side to get away from his finger. The guy kept freaking out. He thinks he wants to do business with Galva. They made him the boss. He should be grateful to them, don't you see? Ian was silent for a second and now asked again. What did he just say? The guy's voice had changed, speaking as if through gritted teeth trying to fight his anger. Hwan looked at him with surprise and some fear. And under goosebumps ran down his face. What? He'd better listen while he's still patient. If he tells Galv, it'll be worse. But suddenly Ian agreed. He cooled down and said he thought his friend was right. He was taken. Well, time to cool down. What does he want? Hwan clenched his fists in his hands. Well, what the hell was that just now? Who's he talking to now? Naturally, he didn't notice the main character had already freed himself and was standing behind him. Suddenly, the guy literally felt with his back that someone was approaching him. and it could only be one person. From the realization of this, his breath caught. Ivan turned his head around, and on shaky legs continued to stand there without moving. The protagonist was coming closer and closer to him in small steps. He lowered his head and walked towards him like some kind of rag doll. The boy did not understand how it was possible. How could he break free? He had just been tied up. He looked at the protagonist with eyes full of horror, and it seemed that he had already accepted his fate. Junho stood up from his seat and the same crazy smile appeared on his face again. He looked forward at his victims, small trickles of blood flowing from his mouth. Ivan took his ward's mouth. Yes, how dare he set it up and beg. He thinks he'll be all right after this. Yes, he's finished. Ian stood simply and didn't move, just stared into his comrade's eyes. The guy suddenly couldn't take it anymore and without trying, hit him in the nose with his forehead. There was a loud crunch and Huan grabbed his nose, which was already bleeding. Falling to his knees, the guy kept screaming. How dare they just do that? How dare he hit him? I looked down at him from above and the gaze was as contemptuous as possible. The main character listened to them all and continued to concentrate his demonic energy in his hand. There already appeared something like a rift space from which a knife began to come out. Smiling, he twitched his hand and prepared to plunge the knife directly into his chest. The boy didn't even aim. He already knew exactly what he had to do. The boy turned into a real assassin, a real maniac who sees only victims in front of him. Huan noticed this and stopped screaming. He realized he wouldn't have a chance later. The boy braced himself for the possibility that he was about to die. His eyes filled with terror, and his whole life began to flash before his eyes. After a few seconds, he felt a powerful rush of more throughout his body. The boy clutched at his chest and began rolling around on the floor and squirming in pain. The main character stood and just looked at him. The boy continued to roll around on the floor and didn't understand anything. What the hell is even going on? Why is he in so much pain? What had this kid done to him? He was crawling around on the floor and trying to regroup. Huan knew it was dangerous. He could die here. Screw it, somebody help him too. The guy gritted his teeth and started to completely shake with fear. Honestly couldn't do anything. It seems his credibility had been undermined. He looked at John Hoon and he had no other choice. He apologized to him and begged him to help him. But the fellow looked at him. After listening to the pleas for help, the guy clenched his hands into fists. He said that he just had to turn him in. Then his job would be done, and the day when his men wouldn't have to bow their heads to Galva would finally come. The boy was incredibly relieved. The protagonist put on his mask and said that Guy had nothing to worry about. He wouldn't give him up. After all, he had helped him in carrying out his plan. The boy kept shaking with fear and looked at the protagonist. Junho stopped putting on his mask and stopped for a second. But what would he get if he turned him in? Yang lit a cigarette. What's he saying? He's really different, okay? I think it's time to tell him. Huan promised him that their leader would stop bullying his gang if they gave him to them. The protagonist ironically asked him, and he really believes that? As soon as the boy heard this question, his eyes widened. And really, what's stopping these creeps from fooling them again? Just like they did before. Junho glanced at him with his eyes and asked, did he really think these creeps would keep their word? That would just be ridiculous. Yang, he asked the protagonist, is he saying that they are lying? Junho said, suggesting that he's going to suggest that he check to see if they're really lying or not. That's a very easy thing to do. Guy he came closer to him and asked if he was willing to answer for his words. That's a very serious statement. They stood opposite each other and glared at each other. The protagonist smiled like a maniac again. He said that the guys just need to check if he's lying or not. He won't lose anything, right? That's logical, isn't it? Jan puffed on his cigarette and thought. He was faced with a difficult choice. On the one hand, he was on the verge of death, because if Galwa found out about it, he and his bandit would be finished. On the other hand, perhaps this maniac could kill him, or help him get rid of his fear. But still, after much hesitation, the guy still made a decision. He looked down from above with a calm gaze. The boy walked to the door and opened it and turned to heaven. There was a note of regret in his voice, and he looked at him with a look of despair. Yang said that he was very mistaken in trusting him. From now on, he is no longer his six. The guy was lying on the ground and didn't understand anything. He was holding onto his chest, which was still hurting, and that was the last time they would see him. Jan closed the door and looked at his former boss with a look as if he was ready to kill him now. The last rays of light extinguished this room, leaving it in pitch blackness. Hevan screamed. He begged the guy to wait, and not to leave him alone with this monster, but unfortunately all his prayers were in vain. The doors closed, and there was a great slamming sound. So the boy was left alone with the maniac. Now there's no one to save him. Junho slowly approached him from behind, holding a knife in his hands. The boy was already anticipating what he would do to him. Hwan was shaking with fear. He realized that now it was his hour of death, and that no one and nothing could help him. The protagonist spat out a clot of blood, along with a knocked-out tooth. The boys did not feel any pain. The tooth would grow back anyway, but he had a very funny entertainment ahead of him. He leaned over to his victim and, smiling, asked why he was trembling. Was he afraid of him? Yes, he was afraid. More afraid than anything else in the world, and he realized that now he was finished. Junho looked at him, and his eyes reflected incredible cruelty and madness. The boy realized that he was in his power, and now he was free to do whatever he wanted with him. Now his long-awaited revenge would be served. Another of Galva's henchmen would now die, and soon, so would he. Gino stood with his hands in his pockets. An angel stood across from him, and they talked together. The angel asked the boy, "He knows everything, doesn't he?" Gino asked the girl, what was she doing here? What was so important that he put a barrier on this place? The boy asked the angel in surprise, what should he know? Here's him asking for a sign. I wonder what there is that he should know that the mighty angels don't know. It's funny, isn't it? Raziel smiled and replied, that's a rather rude way to greet someone you haven't seen in a year. However, that is not the point now. Gino turned his back to him and said that they had better get to the point of the question, or his face would ruin his mood. The boy was annoyed beyond belief. Angel smiled and said that so-and-so. He wouldn't beat around the bush, they'd better get to the point. The girl looked at him and repeated her phrase. He is already perfectly aware of it. The guy looked at her with an uncomprehending look. He already knows who Faust is, doesn't he? Junho was already almost going crazy with pleasure. He was anticipating the taste of blood on his lips, and now he was going to kill the bastard. And no one in the world would be able to stop him. Hwan hesitantly but quickly forward. He couldn't stand up because of the pain. Why was this happening to him specifically? He was tormented with questions, and all he wanted was to finally survive and get out of here. The main character smiled and cheered him up. Come on, is that all he's got? Why so little? The guy was smiling and looking forward to the kill, like a predator stalking its wounded prey, knowing it couldn't escape. Junho held a glowing dagger in his hands and just followed the boy, who was trying his best to crawl away. This was just the beginning, after all. He almost laughed with joy. Hevan was trembling with fear. He was begging the protagonist to stop. Right now, he was willing to suffer any humiliation just to keep his life. He, who had never cried before in his life, was now roaring like a girl. He was now truly afraid for his life. How did this happen? He couldn't believe this was happening to him. He only wanted to live a different life. The guy already mentally resigned himself to the fact that he was finished. There was an unbelievable horror in his eyes. He couldn't believe who could believe that his whole life was literally falling apart right in front of his eyes. A few seconds now, and this monster would simply finish him off in one blow. Or no, it would be much worse. He would torture him first to beat him in agony. He remembered himself as a very young schoolboy, when he had not yet contacted ZA, was just a little innocent child, and dreamed of something, but never thought that he would have to become so cruel.